After a life-saving transplant, a wealthy man begins experiencing memories that aren't his own. Within hospital corridors and luxury estates, medical records reveal an impossible connection. Between cellular memory and social reality lies a truth that proves some hearts remember what minds forget. As past lives merge, destiny proves stronger than death. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The sterile scent of antiseptic still clung to Arthur's skin, a stark contrast to the luxurious silk sheets of his hospital room. He lay staring at the ornate ceiling, the rhythmic thump-thump-thump of his new heart a constant, unsettling reminder of the drastic change in his life. The surgery had been a success. Dr. Ramirez had assured him, a miracle even. But the miracle felt tainted. A wave of dizziness washed over him, accompanied by a fleeting image, a woman's laughter, bright and carefree, echoing across a sun-drenched beach. He flinched, his heart hammering against his ribs, a frantic rhythm that had nothing to do with the newly transplanted organ. This wasn't his memory. Couldn't be. Eleanor entered, her face etched with worry. "Arthur, you're pale. Are you all right?" Her voice held a carefully controlled tremor that betrayed her concern. He'd always appreciated her composure, her elegant distance, but now it felt like a wall, a cold, impenetrable barrier. I don't know," he whispered, the words catching in his throat. He tried to explain the fragmented images that plagued him, the snippets of a life utterly foreign to his own meticulously ordered existence. But the words seemed inadequate, the memories too elusive to grasp. Eleanor's brow furrowed. "Arthur, you've been acting strangely since the surgery. Distant, haunted." Her hand reached out, hesitant, then rested on his. The touch, usually a formality, felt jarring, foreign. He felt nothing but a confusing mixture of guilt and fear. "It's like someone else is living inside me," he confessed, his voice barely a breath. The fear was raw, visceral. He had always prized control, his life a perfectly orchestrated symphony. Now, a discordant note had crashed through, disrupting the harmony, threatening to unravel everything. The luxury of his life, the carefully constructed facade of his success, felt brittle, inadequate in the face of this unsettling intrusion. The rhythmic thump of his new heart echoed his inner turmoil. The transplant hadn't just saved his life, it had irrevocably altered it, and he didn't know if he could bear it. The following days were a blur of medical tests and anxious silences. The sterile white of the hospital walls seemed to amplify Arthur's internal turmoil. The scent of antiseptic, once a symbol of sterile hope, now clung to him like a shroud. He flinched at the slightest touch, Eleanor's concerned hand hovering near him, feeling alien, unwelcome. He tried to explain his terrifying visions, a child's laughter in a sun-drenched garden, a woman's face etched with sorrow, a cottage perched on a windswept cliff. But the words felt inadequate, the memories fleeting, elusive whispers in the vast chambers of his mind. Dr. Ramirez, his eyes filled with a mixture of professional concern and genuine empathy, tried to reassure him. "Cellular memory," he'd explained, his voice a soft counterpoint to the rhythmic beeping of monitors. A phenomenon we're only beginning to understand, but the explanation offered little comfort. Cellular memory. It sounded like science fiction, yet the terrifying reality of it pulsed within his own chest. One evening, Eleanor sat beside his bed, her usual composure fractured. The faint scent of her perfume, usually a source of comfort, now felt like another barrier between them. "Arthur," she began, her voice trembling slightly, I'm scared. You're not yourself." He looked at her, her face softened by worry, a stark contrast to the hard exterior he'd always known. A wave of guilt washed over him, a profound sadness at the disruption he was causing in their meticulously ordered life. "I'm trying to understand," he whispered, the words catching in his throat. "But it's like, I'm not alone in here." The fear was a cold knot in his stomach, tightening with each passing moment. He longed to reach out to her, to bridge the chasm that was opening between them, but the fear of revealing the full extent of his experiences held him back. A silent scream trapped within his chest. The thump, thump, thump of his new heart mirrored the frantic rhythm of his fear. His carefully constructed world was crumbling, and he was powerless to stop it. The luxury of his life, once a source of pride, now felt like a gilded cage. He wanted out, but he didn't know how to escape. The sterile scent of the hospital, once a symbol of hope, now felt suffocating. Arthur lay in bed, the rhythmic thump of his new heart a relentless percussion against the silence. He stared at the ceiling, the fluorescent lights buzzing like trapped wasps. Eleanor's presence beside him felt less like comfort and more like a looming shadow. Her hand, usually cool and distant, rested on his, a tentative touch that only amplified his unease. "It's the cottage," he whispered, the words catching in his throat. The image of it, perched precariously on a cliff overlooking a churning sea, flashed in his mind. Salt spray, the cry of gulls, a child's laughter echoing against the wind, sensations so vivid they felt like a second skin. Eleanor squeezed his hand, her touch laced with a mixture of concern and fear. "The cottage? What cottage, Arthur?" He couldn't explain. The memories were fragmented, shards of glass reflecting a life he didn't know. He tried to describe the woman's laugh, the warmth of the sun on his skin, the feel of sand between his toes, but the words came out jumbled, inadequate. The emotional weight of the memories was crushing him. "It's like someone else lived there," he stammered, his voice thick with emotion. Like I was there." Silence descended, thick and heavy. The only sound was the steady beep of the heart monitor, a relentless reminder of the life beating within him, a life that wasn't entirely his own. Eleanor's silence was more eloquent than any words. It spoke of fear, confusion, and a dawning sense of loss. He saw the flicker of suspicion in her eyes, a crack in the facade of their carefully constructed marriage. Dr. Ramirez entered, his footsteps quiet but purposeful. He sat on the edge of the bed, his gaze steady and empathetic. "Arthur," he began gently, "these memories, are they consistent? Do they form a narrative?" Arthur shook his head, a tremor running through him. The memories were chaotic, beautiful, painful fragments of a life he was piecing together in the dark. He felt adrift, lost in a sea of unfamiliar emotions, a stranger in his own body. The fear was not just for his sanity. It was for the future, for his relationship with Eleanor, for the terrifying unknown that this new heart had brought into his life. He felt a deep, gnawing fear, the realization that his carefully ordered world was not only crumbling, it was being replaced with something he didn't understand, something he was only beginning to fear. And within that fear, a fragile spark of something else, curiosity, a burning need to discover the truth behind the whispers in his heart. The next morning, the sterile white of the hospital room felt less oppressive. Sunlight, filtered through the sheer curtains, painted stripes across the polished floor. Arthur, however, felt no such lightness. The fragmented memories, vivid as a fever dream, returned with the dawn. He saw the cottage again, the woman's laughter clearer this time, a melody woven with the scent of sea salt and wood smoke. He felt the child's small hand in his, a pressure so gentle, so real, it brought tears to his eyes. Eleanor entered, carrying a tray laden with breakfast, her expression guarded. "How are you feeling?" she asked, her voice carefully neutral. Arthur swallowed, the lump in his throat making speech difficult. "Worse," he admitted, his voice barely a whisper. "The memories, they're stronger." Eleanor sat beside him, her hand hovering over his. He flinched at the touch, a primal reaction to this invasion of his identity. He saw the hurt in her eyes, a mirrored reflection of his own inner turmoil. "Arthur," she began softly, her voice betraying a tremor. "You need to talk to someone, Dr. Ramirez, or perhaps a therapist." He shook his head, the motion jarring his already fragile equilibrium. It's not just memories, Eleanor. It's like I was him, like I lived that life. The fear he felt was a physical weight pressing down on his chest. Eleanor's face paled. Her hand, previously hesitant, now grasped his with surprising strength. Who was he? Her voice held a mixture of fear and a strange, unsettling curiosity. I don't know, he whispered, staring at the rhythmic pulse of the heart monitor. A constant reminder of the life he was wrestling with, a life that wasn't his own. But I need to find out. The curiosity was now stronger than the fear. A determination hardened his gaze. He wouldn't let this consume him. He would understand, and in understanding, perhaps, find a way through this terrifying new reality. The seed of obsession had been planted, and it was beginning to grow. He was no longer just a patient. He was an investigator, driven by a need to unravel the mystery at the heart of his being. The journey to understand his new reality would be fraught with doubt, danger, and unimaginable emotional pain. But Arthur was now resolved. He would find the truth. The sterile scent of antiseptic clung to Arthur like a second skin. He sat on the edge of his hospital bed, the crisp white sheets a stark contrast to the swirling chaos within him. The fragmented memories, no longer fleeting glimpses, were coalescing, forming unsettlingly vivid scenes. He saw the seaside cottage again, the worn wooden floorboards beneath his bare feet, the salty tang of the sea air filling his lungs. He heard the woman's laughter, a joyous sound laced with a melancholy undercurrent he couldn't quite grasp. Eleanor entered, her face etched with worry. "Arthur," she said softly, her voice laced with concern that barely masked a deeper unease. "Dr. Ramirez wants to see you." He nodded, the movement sending a wave of dizziness through him. The doctor's words, though kind, felt clinical, detached from the emotional maelstrom raging inside him. The transplant was successful, Dr. Ramirez had said, his voice professional. But there are some unusual side effects. Unusual was an understatement. Arthur felt like a fractured mosaic, the pieces of his life, rearranged, repurposed. He pushed the covers aside, the cool cotton against his skin a slight relief from the burning intensity of the memories. He knew he needed to find out more, to understand this terrifying intrusion into his being. He needed to know who Daniel was. The mention of Daniel's name felt like a physical blow. It stirred a painful longing he couldn't explain, a grief that wasn't his, yet resonated deep within his soul. The hospital corridor felt oppressive, the fluorescent lights harsh and unforgiving. But the thought of uncovering the truth propelled him forward. This wasn't just about strange memories. It was about understanding the very core of his identity, a puzzle with terrifyingly high stakes. The weight of this new reality pressed down on him, but the determination to unravel this mystery was stronger than his fear. He had to find out who this Daniel was, and how this man's life had become so irrevocably intertwined with his own. This investigation, he knew, was the only way to start to reclaim his own life, one memory, one painful truth at a time. The sterile scent of the hospital faded as Arthur stepped into the cool evening air. The city lights blurred through his tears, a shimmering, indistinct backdrop to the turmoil within. He clutched Daniel's medical file, the crisp paper a cold comfort against the burning ache in his chest. Eleanor's words echoed in his ears, a brittle whisper of disbelief and fear. This isn't you, Arthur." He wasn't sure anymore. He hailed a cab, the yellow glow a fleeting beacon in the encroaching darkness. Inside, the leather seats felt unfamiliar, yet oddly comforting. He opened the file, the faint scent of old paper and ink oddly familiar, like a forgotten dream. Daniel's photograph stared back at him, a young man with laughing eyes and a mischievous grin, a stark contrast to Arthur's usual reserved demeanor. He traced the outline of the photo with a trembling finger, a wave of sorrow washing over him, so profound it stole his breath. "This is him," he whispered, his voice raw with emotion. The cab driver, a man with kind eyes and a weathered face, glanced at him in the rearview mirror. "Something troubling you, son?" Arthur shook his head, unable to articulate the chaotic mix of grief, confusion, and a burgeoning sense of connection. He reached for the next page, his fingers tracing the lines of Daniel's journal entries, fragments of a life lived with vibrant intensity. Sun-drenched days spent painting by the sea, passionate declarations of love, the bittersweet sorrow of loss. Each entry felt like a punch to the gut, a painful reminder of the life he'd never lived, yet somehow intimately knew. The cab pulled up to the address on the file, a modest apartment building nestled in a quiet, tree-lined street. Arthur felt a knot of apprehension tighten in his stomach. He wasn't sure what he'd find, but he knew he had to try. He had to understand. He had to find Clara. The apartment building loomed, a stark contrast to Arthur's usual opulent surroundings. Cracked paint peeled from the walls, a muted echo of neglect. He hesitated, the weight of Daniel's life pressing down on him. He could turn back, retreat to the familiar comfort of his sterile, echoing mansion. But the image of Daniel's laughing eyes burned in his memory, a defiant flame against the encroaching darkness of his own life. He climbed the creaking stairs, each step a deliberate decision. The air hung heavy with the scent of old linoleum and something faintly sweet, like dried flowers. He reached the third floor, his hand trembling as he knocked on the door. Number 307. A moment of silence, pregnant with anticipation. Then, the sound of shuffling footsteps, followed by the click of a latch. The door opened to reveal a woman with Daniel's eyes, large, luminous, and brimming with a cautious warmth. "Clara, you're Arthur," she said, her voice soft, laced with a hesitant hope. She resembled Daniel but bore a stronger, more resilient quality. "Yes," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. He offered a hesitant smile, a gesture as unfamiliar to him as this worn, humble doorway. He held out the medical file. I'm here because of Daniel." Clara's gaze softened, a flicker of recognition in her eyes. She opened the door wider, inviting him inside. The apartment was small, sparsely furnished, but filled with the vibrant remnants of a life lived with passionate intensity. Paintbrushes lay scattered across a small table, alongside tubes of vibrant colors. Photographs, sketches, and canvases adorned the walls, each a testament to Daniel's artistic soul. The air thrummed with the faint scent of turpentine and linseed oil, a ghostly perfume of Daniel's presence. "Come in," she repeated, her voice catching slightly. "Please, I've been waiting." A single tear traced a path down her cheek, mirroring the grief that had settled deep within Arthur's own heart. He stepped across the threshold, entering not just a small apartment, but a world, a life, that now felt inextricably woven with his own. The journey had only just begun. The worn armchair creaked under Arthur's weight. Clara offered him tea, the steam curling upwards like a shy question mark. The apartment, bathed in the soft glow of the setting sun, felt less like a stranger's home and more like a forgotten memory rediscovered. He sipped the tea, the warmth spreading through him, a comforting balm against the chilling uncertainty of the past few weeks. "He was happy here," Clara murmured, her voice barely above a whisper, her gaze drifting to a half-finished canvas leaning against the wall. The vibrant colors seemed to pulse with a life of their own, a testament to Daniel's passionate spirit. Arthur nodded, his throat tight. I can feel it." The words felt inadequate, a poor substitute for the torrent of emotions swirling within him. He saw Daniel in the chaotic beauty of the studio, in the careless splatter of paint on the floor, in the gentle curve of a worn paintbrush. A shared silence settled between them, broken only by the rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner, each tick a measured beat of their shared grief. Clara picked up a photograph, a faded image of Daniel laughing, his arms slung around a young girl. "That's Lily," she said softly, her voice catching. "His niece. He adored her." Arthur felt a pang of something akin to familial love, a feeling both foreign and profoundly moving. He saw himself in Daniel's smile, a flicker of warmth and joy hidden beneath a carefully constructed facade. It was a mirror reflecting a life he hadn't lived, but a life he was now, in some inexplicable way, inheriting. He reached for the photograph, his fingers tracing the outline of Daniel's smiling face. He seems so alive, he whispered, the words catching in his throat. Clara smiled sadly. He was full of life, full of dreams. She paused, then added with quiet determination, "And I intend to make sure those dreams don't die with him." Her gaze met his, a silent promise passing between them, a shared resolve to honor Daniel's memory. The weight of Daniel's life, once a crushing burden, now felt lighter, less like a theft and more like a sacred trust. The sterile scent of antiseptic still clung to Arthur, a phantom smell from the hospital, even in the luxurious comfort of his own home. Eleanor sat across from him, a distance echoing the chasm that had grown between them. The sunlight filtering through the tall windows painted stripes across her face, highlighting the worry etched around her eyes. She hadn't touched her coffee, the delicate china cup untouched. "Arthur," she began, her voice low and hesitant. "The doctor called again. He wants you back for more tests." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken anxieties. Her gaze lingered on his hands, gnarled and unfamiliar, hands that seemed to hold the weight of a life he hadn't lived. Arthur's own heart ached with a different kind of pain, Daniel's pain. He saw the seaside cottage again in his mind's eye, the laughter of a woman he couldn't quite place, the smell of salt and seaweed heavy in the air. The memory, sharp and vivid, was a relentless tide pulling him away from Eleanor, from his life, from himself. I don't know what to say, Eleanor," he whispered, his voice rough. The words felt inadequate, a flimsy shield against the emotional onslaught. He wanted to tell her everything, about Daniel, about the stolen memories, about the chilling possibility that he was someone else entirely. But the fear held him back, a cold knot in his stomach. "You've changed, Arthur," Eleanor said, her voice finally gaining strength, laced with a mixture of fear and accusation. "You're different." She reached out, her hand hovering over his, then retreated as if burned. He met her gaze, seeing in her eyes the reflection of his own turmoil. The unspoken words hung between them, thick with unspoken fears and burgeoning suspicions. He wanted to reach for her, to reassure her, to bridge the gap that had opened up between them. But the weight of Daniel's life, the burden of his memories, held him captive. The future stretched before him, a vast and uncertain landscape, and in that moment, Arthur understood the terrifying truth. He was lost, adrift in a sea of borrowed memories, his identity shattered, his future uncertain, his only solace lying in the shared grief of a sister he barely knew. The weight of his stolen life pressed down, heavy and inescapable. The hospital hallway hummed with a low, persistent thrum, the rhythmic beep of heart monitors, the hushed whispers of nurses, the squeak of rolling wheels. Arthur walked, his reflection a stranger in the polished steel of a passing cart. He felt Daniel's presence acutely, a phantom limb ache in his chest, a bittersweet echo of a life lived and lost. The sterile scent, once a symbol of his own near-death experience, now smelled of Daniel's final moments. He stopped before Dr. Ramirez's office, the wood panel door a stark contrast to the clinical sterility of the rest of the hospital. He knocked, a hesitant sound that mirrored his inner turmoil. "Come in, Arthur." Dr. Ramirez's voice was calm, reassuring. Arthur entered, the doctor's desk cluttered with files and charts. He sat heavily in the offered chair, the plush leather a deceptive comfort. The tests, they confirmed some unusual activity. Dr. Ramirez began, his gaze searching. He pushed a file across the desk, the paper crisp and white. "Your cellular memory, it's reacting in ways we've never witnessed before." Arthur's gaze dropped to the file, the words blurring. "Unusual activity." He knew it was more than unusual. It was impossible. His throat tightened. "What does it mean, doctor?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "It means the memories. They aren't just memories, Arthur. They are integrated. Part of you now. Your body, your mind. They're merging." Dr. Ramirez paused, choosing his words carefully. "We are seeing a cellular-level integration of your DNA with the donors. We don't understand the full implications yet, A cold dread settled over Arthur, heavier than any physical pain. He pictured Clara's face, the raw grief in her eyes, the quiet strength in her voice when she'd spoken of Daniel. He felt a pang of guilt, a wave of profound sadness that washed over him, leaving him breathless. It wasn't just memories. It was a life he was inheriting, a life of pain and joy, love and loss, all entwined with his own. Is there a way to separate them? He asked, the question a desperate plea. Dr. Ramirez shook his head slowly. I don't know, Arthur. This is unprecedented. We are learning as we go. But one thing is clear. This isn't simply a case of psychological trauma. He leaned forward, his voice softening. Arthur, you need to prepare yourself. This is a journey. The sterile scent of antiseptic clung to Arthur like a second skin. He sat on the edge of his plush hospital bed, the crisp white sheets a stark contrast to the turmoil within him. Eleanor's hand rested lightly on his, her touch cool and distant, a reflection of the emotional chasm that had opened between them. The fragmented memories continued, a burst of laughter echoing from a sun-drenched beach, the salty tang of sea air, the warmth of a small hand clasped in his. They felt intensely real, yet utterly alien. It's happening again, he murmured, his voice raspy. Eleanor's eyes, usually bright with a controlled intensity, held a flicker of something akin to fear. What is, Arthur? She asked, her voice tight with unspoken anxieties. He closed his eyes, trying to grasp the fleeting images, the elusive sensations. I see a cottage by the sea, a woman laughing. It's so vivid, Eleanor, but it's not mine. He opened his eyes, meeting her gaze. The unspoken question hung heavy in the air. Was he losing his mind? Or was something far stranger unfolding? The silence stretched, punctuated only by the rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor, a relentless counterpoint to the chaotic rhythm of his memories. The fear was palpable, a thick fog blurring the edges of his reality. He felt a deep, desperate need to understand, to unravel the mystery before it consumed him entirely. He needed answers, and he knew where to find them. His hand clenched into a fist, a surge of resolve coursing through him. The investigation, the search for the truth, it had to begin now. His fate, and perhaps another's, depended on it. The fluorescent hum of the hospital corridor was a stark counterpoint to the sun-drenched beach he saw, impossibly vivid in his mind's eye. The salty tang of the air, the feel of warm sand between his toes. It was a sensory overload, a collision of realities. He clutched the worn leather of his briefcase, its familiar texture a lifeline in this swirling vortex of memory. Eleanor's voice, a hushed whisper, cut through the phantom sounds of the sea. Arthur, are you all right? He looked at her, the concern etched on her face, a stark contrast to the joyless precision of her usually composed demeanor. He saw a flicker of fear behind the practiced concern, a fear mirroring his own. He swallowed, the lump in his throat a physical manifestation of his fear. I don't know, he confessed, his voice barely above a breath. These memories, they're so real, yet impossible. He needed proof. He needed to know who this man was, the man whose laughter echoed in his dreams, whose life was somehow intertwined with his own. Back in his private room, the hushed elegance of the suite failed to mask the unsettling truth. He opened his briefcase, the smooth metallic click a counterpoint to the racing beat of his new heart. The medical files lay before him, crisp and official, detailing the donor Daniel, a young artist with a life that felt both heartbreakingly beautiful and achingly distant. A life filled with passion and joy, a stark contrast to his own carefully constructed existence of wealth and emotional detachment. He picked up a faded photograph, Daniel, laughing, his arm around a woman with fiery red hair, a carefree joy radiating from the image. A wave of something akin to grief washed over Arthur, a profound sadness for a life he'd never lived, yet somehow intimately knew. The photograph slipped from his trembling fingers, falling onto the plush carpet with a soft thud. The silence stretched, broken only by his ragged breathing. The reality of the situation began to settle upon him in waves. the weight of the unknown growing heavier with every passing moment. This wasn't just about stolen memories. It was about a life stolen, a life he was now inextricably bound to. The search for answers, for the truth, no longer felt like an option. It was a desperate, consuming need. He had to find Clara, Daniel's sister. He had to uncover what lay hidden beneath the surface of these impossible, yet undeniably real, memories. The weight of it, the responsibility, the sheer emotional turmoil, it threatened to overwhelm him. But a new resolve hardened his gaze. He would face this. He had to. The cool, sterile scent of antiseptic clung to Arthur's skin even after he'd showered, a constant reminder of the life-altering surgery. He stared at his reflection, the familiar face subtly altered, softened perhaps, by something he couldn't quite define. The vibrant beach scene, the laughter, the woman with fiery red hair. They weren't fading. They were intensifying, weaving themselves into the fabric of his being. Fear warred with a burgeoning curiosity. He picked up the phone, his hand trembling slightly. He hesitated, the simple act of dialing a number suddenly fraught with unexpected weight. Eleanor was in the study. He knew the quiet click of her laptop keys, a familiar background hum in their otherwise silent home. He pictured her, the elegant lines of her face etched with a worry he'd always dismissed as mere concern for his health, but which now felt laced with something darker. Distrust. He finally dialed Clara's number, the digits a strange comfort in this unfamiliar landscape of his own mind. The ring echoed in the opulent silence of his study, each tone a hammer blow against the walls of his carefully constructed life. Clara answered on the third ring, her voice hesitant, but with a warmth that felt shockingly familiar. "Hello, Clara," he began, his voice rough. This is Arthur. I know it sounds strange, but I need to speak with you. About Daniel." Silence hung heavy between them, broken only by Arthur's ragged breathing. The silence was thick, heavy, pregnant with unspoken emotion. He could almost hear her thinking, processing the absurdity of his call. Then her voice, softer now, laced with a cautious curiosity. "Arthur? Daniel's heart recipient? Is everything all right?" "No," he admitted, his voice cracking. "Far from it. I'm experiencing things. Memories. They're Daniel's memories. I need to understand." The words tumbled out, a torrent of confession that both relieved and terrified him. He closed his eyes, bracing himself for her reaction. Would she believe him? Would she dismiss him as delusional? Or would she understand, in a way he couldn't yet fathom, the impossible truth of his situation? The weight of the unknown hung heavy, a suffocating blanket of uncertainty. The phone felt clammy in his hand, a physical manifestation of his fear and desperate hope. The future, once a predictable landscape of wealth and quiet comfort, now stretched before him, an uncharted wilderness filled with both terror and a strange, unsettling promise. Clara's hesitant hello hung in the air, a fragile thread connecting two disparate lives. Arthur gripped the phone, the cool, smooth surface a stark contrast to the frantic beat of his own heart, Daniel's heart, a relentless drum against his ribs. He could almost taste the metallic tang of fear, a bitter aftertaste to the burgeoning hope that sparked with Clara's cautiously curious response. The opulent silence of his study, usually a sanctuary of calm, pressed down on him, amplifying the tremor in his voice. "Clara," he began, his voice a raw whisper, barely audible above the frantic pulse in his ears. This is Arthur. I know it sounds strange, but I need to speak with you. About Daniel." A long silence stretched between them, filled only with the muted hum of the city beyond his soundproofed windows. He imagined her, in her small apartment, perhaps surrounded by Daniel's art, the vibrant colors a painful counterpoint to the stark monochrome of his own life. He felt the weight of Daniel's memories pressing down, a kaleidoscope of seaside cottages, laughter echoing from sun-drenched beaches, the gentle warmth of a child's hand. Memories he couldn't claim as his own, yet felt ingrained in the very marrow of his being. "Arthur?" Daniel's heart recipient? Is everything all right? Clara's voice was soft, tinged with a hesitant concern that mirrored his own apprehension. No, he confessed, the word escaping in a ragged breath. Far from it. I'm experiencing things. Memories. They're Daniel's memories. I need to understand. The confession spilled out, a torrent of words he hadn't known he possessed. A desperate attempt to bridge the impossible chasm between two lives, two hearts. He closed his eyes, the cool silk of his pajamas a paltry comfort against the sudden chill that crept over him. He waited, the silence stretched taut, a palpable entity humming with unspoken anxieties and hesitant hope. Clara's voice, hesitant and laced with worry, reached him through the phone, a lifeline in the swirling vortex of his life. Arthur, Daniel's heart recipient? Is everything all right? The question hung in the air, a fragile echo of his own turmoil. He looked around his opulent study, the polished mahogany desk reflecting the city lights like a shimmering mirror to his fractured soul. The usual comfort of his surroundings felt alien, a gilded cage trapping him in a reality that was no longer entirely his. No, he confessed, the word a ragged gasp against the backdrop of the city's muted hum. Far from it. I'm experiencing things. Memories. They're Daniel's memories. The words tumbled out, a desperate attempt to release the pressure building within his chest. A pressure that had nothing to do with his physical heart, and everything to do with the ghost of another life inhabiting his own. He could feel the weight of those memories, a tangible burden pressing down on him. The scent of salt and seaweed, the feel of warm sand between his toes, the taste of sun-ripened peaches, sensations so vivid, so utterly real, they felt like stolen moments plucked from another life entirely. He saw Daniel's seaside cottage, a vision so sharp it felt like a photograph imprinted on his mind. The laughter of a woman he didn't know, yet felt intimately connected to. The memory of a small hand, clutching his own, sent a wrenching pang of sorrow through him. Whose child was it? His? Daniel's? A silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken anxieties and hesitant hope. He pictured Clara in her modest apartment, surrounded by Daniel's vibrant artwork, a stark contrast to the muted tones of his own sterile, emotionally barren life. The silence intensified, the ticking of a grandfather clock in the hall a counterpoint to the erratic rhythm of his heart. I need to understand, he whispered, his voice breaking slightly. The admission, though barely audible, was a seismic shift, a confession that shook the foundations of his carefully constructed existence. He was no longer just Arthur, the wealthy, emotionally detached businessman. He was also Daniel, an artist who had lived and loved with a passionate intensity that Arthur had only ever envied from afar. I don't understand, Clara whispered back, her voice filled with confusion and a hint of fear. What memories? Her words were cautious, probing, but beneath the hesitation, Arthur sensed a flicker of understanding, a shared sense of the impossible. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for the journey ahead. This wasn't just about understanding Daniel's past. It was about confronting the unsettling truth of his own present and the impossible future that lay before them both. The phone felt warm against his ear, a connection to a life he never lived, yet somehow, inexplicably, now felt utterly his own. The journey was fraught with uncertainty, fear, and potential pain. Yet within the echoing silence, a faint glimmer of hope shone through the darkness. The sterile scent of antiseptic clung to Arthur like a second skin. Motes of dust dancing in the still air, each a tiny, fleeting memory. The scent of salt and pine, a tangible echo of Daniel's life, clung to the worn wooden furniture, a bittersweet perfume of loss. Clara's quiet grief was a palpable presence, a heavy weight settling in the room. Her eyes, the same shade of hazel as Daniel's, were brimming with unshed tears. Arthur watched her, a knot of guilt tightening in his chest. He'd come bearing legal documents, cold, impersonal evidence of a crime, yet he felt utterly inadequate. The papers felt like a betrayal of the fragile trust that had sprung between them. They They didn't just take his life, Clara whispered, her voice cracking, tracing the lines of a photograph showing a younger Daniel, laughing, his face bright with life. They stole a part of him, a part of us. She touched the photograph, her fingers lingering on his smiling face. The unspoken accusation hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Arthur reached for her hand, his own trembling. "I know," he murmured, the words catching in his throat. He felt the ghost of Daniel's touch in her hand, a phantom sensation connecting them across the chasm of life and death. The shared sorrow, the mutual outrage against the injustice, forged an unexpected bond between them. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was filled with the weight of unspoken emotions, a shared understanding of profound loss, a silent vow to fight for justice. Outside, the wind rustled the leaves, a mournful sigh against the backdrop of the encroaching twilight. The fight had begun, and Arthur, carrying Daniel's memories and his grief, knew he would not fight alone. He had found an unexpected ally in Clara, a bond forged in shared loss, a promise of a future shaped by the echoes of a life lost too soon. The weight of Daniel's legacy rested on his shoulders, but now, it wasn't a burden borne alone. The sterile scent of antiseptics still clung to Arthur, a phantom smell from the hospital that haunted him even in the opulent silence of his home. Eleanor, perched on a silk-covered chaise lounge, watched him with a mixture of apprehension and simmering resentment. He paced, the polished marble floor cold beneath his bare feet, a stark contrast to the warmth of the memories that consumed him. "This obsession, it's unhealthy, Arthur." Eleanor's voice was brittle, laced with fatigue. The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken accusations. Arthur stopped, his gaze fixed on a framed photograph of himself, a younger, colder version of the man he felt himself becoming. "It's not an obsession, Eleanor. It's understanding, trying to make sense of this invasion of my life." He ran a hand through his hair, the gesture revealing a weariness that went beyond physical exhaustion. The memories, Daniel's laughter, the feel of the paintbrush in his hand, the salty tang of the sea air were becoming less intrusive, less fragmented, more integrated. It was a terrifying and exhilarating blurring of identities. "You're changing, Arthur," Eleanor insisted, her voice rising slightly. "You're not the man I married." He sighed, the sound a mixture of sorrow and resignation. "I don't know who I am anymore, Eleanor. Part of me is still me, but a significant part, a vibrant, passionate part, is Daniel." He looked at the photograph again, the cold, distant man staring back seeming like a stranger. He felt a pang of guilt, a sharp stab of grief for the life he'd lived, for the opportunities lost, the emotions suppressed, all hidden behind the facade of wealth and success. "Clara, she understands," he whispered, more to himself than to Eleanor. "She sees it too, the connection, the theft, the injustice." The mention of Clara's name sparked a fresh wave of Eleanor's anger. The jealousy, once a subtle undercurrent, now pulsed like a throbbing vein in her forehead. "This woman, she's just manipulating you, Arthur, using your grief to get what she wants." Arthur shook his head slowly, his gaze softening. "No, Eleanor, she's grieving too. She's lost her brother. And in a way, I've lost myself." He paused, searching for the words to convey the complex emotions swirling within him. "But I'm finding something new, something real, something I never had before." He looked at her, a faint glimmer of hope in his eyes, a hope tinged with the bittersweet knowledge that it came at a terrible cost. The fight for justice was far from over. The fight for his own identity was only just beginning. The salt spray stung Arthur's face as he stood on the cliff overlooking the churning gray sea. The wind, a raw, icy hand, whipped his hair across his eyes, mirroring the turmoil within. Clara stood beside him, her arm a silent offering of comfort, her presence a stark contrast to the desolate landscape. He'd brought her here, to the very spot Daniel had described in his journal. A place of solace, a place of inspiration. Now it felt like a tomb. "He loved this place," Clara whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind's mournful cry. Her eyes, the same shade of sea green as the turbulent waters below, were filled with a sorrow that resonated deep within Arthur. He understood that sorrow now, a visceral ache mirroring the loss he felt for a life he'd never lived, yet somehow intimately knew. He'd spent weeks poring over Daniel's journals, his sketches, his photographs. Each entry was a poignant reminder of a life lived with vibrant intensity, a life that now felt inextricably woven into his own. The vibrant colors of Daniel's paintings now echoed in Arthur's own thoughts, replacing the cold, muted palette of his previous existence. The laughter, once a fleeting memory, now felt like a phantom limb, a constant reminder of what was missing, what was lost, and what he inexplicably possessed. I feel like I'm intruding," Arthur said, his voice thick with unshed tears. The guilt gnawed at him, a persistent, insidious pain. He was a trespasser in Daniel's life, a thief who'd stolen not only his heart, but his memories, his passions, his very essence. Clara placed a hand on his arm, her touch surprisingly strong, grounding him in the present. "You're not intruding, Arthur. You're honoring him, keeping his memory alive." She looked out at the sea, her gaze distant, lost in her own memories. He would have wanted that. The wind howled, a mournful dirge that seemed to echo their shared grief. The weight of their shared loss pressed down on them, a tangible presence in the vast, empty space. The sun, a pale disk struggling through the clouds, cast long, skeletal shadows across the cliff face, highlighting the stark beauty and inherent loneliness of the place. It was a fitting backdrop to their shared sorrow, a powerful reminder of life's fragility and the enduring power of memory. Arthur looked at Clara, seeing not just Daniel's sister, but a kindred spirit, a fellow traveler on this unexpected, grief-stricken journey. He knew then that the fight for justice was only the beginning. The real battle lay within, a battle to reconcile two lives, two identities, into a singular, meaningful existence. The fight to become truly himself. The sterile scent of antiseptic still clung to Arthur's clothes, a stark contrast to the earthy aroma of damp soil and sea salt that clung to his memories of Daniel's cottage. He sat in his opulent study, the polished mahogany desk a cold island in the vast, dimly lit room. Eleanor's absence was a heavy presence, a silent accusation hanging in the air thicker than the dust motes dancing in the moonlight filtering through the tall windows. He picked up Daniel's worn leather-bound journal, its pages filled with sketches and vibrant prose, a stark counterpoint to the blandness of his own life. A photograph slipped from the pages, Daniel, laughing, arms wrapped around Clara, both bathed in the golden light of a summer sunset. The image burned into Arthur's mind, a painful reminder of the life he'd inherited, a life brimming with joy he'd never known. He traced the lines of Daniel's face, the carefree grin a ghost of the memories that haunted him. A wave of nausea rolled over him, a physical manifestation of his emotional turmoil. He closed his eyes, the vibrant colors of the photograph replaced by the gray bleakness of his own past. The guilt was a suffocating weight, pressing down on his chest, mirroring the physical discomfort of his transplanted heart. He opened the journal again, his fingers tracing the delicate strokes of Daniel's pen. A scribbled note caught his eye. "Clara's concert tonight. Hope she's as good as she claims." A pang of longing, sharp and unfamiliar, pierced him. He hadn't attended a concert since college. He craved the experience, the shared emotion, the vibrancy that was so alien to him. The decision to attend hung in the air, a fragile thing, easily shattered by his fear and self-doubt. But the image of Daniel's bright smile, the promise of shared experience with Clara, pushed him forward. He had to honor Daniel. The need to understand, to reconcile, to somehow make amends for this strange, stolen life, propelled him toward the unfamiliar landscape of a vibrant, passionate existence. He picked up his phone, his thumb hovering over Clara's number, a small act of defiance against his past, a tentative step toward his uncertain future. The concert hall hummed with a low thrum of anticipation. Arthur, awkwardly clutching a single, slightly crumpled rose, felt utterly out of place amidst the stylishly dressed crowd. The air vibrated with the scent of perfume and expensive cologne, a stark contrast to the salty tang of the sea air he'd smelled in Daniel's memories. Clara spotted him near the entrance, her face lighting up with a surprised smile. "Arthur," she breathed, rushing towards him. Her hug was warm, genuine, a comforting contrast to Eleanor's distant embraces. "I didn't expect you," Daniel mentioned. "Something about a concert," he mumbled, his voice rough with unfamiliar emotion. He offered her the rose. "For you." Clara's smile widened, a touch of sadness softening its edges. "He always did love surprising me." She tucked the rose behind her ear, the gesture strangely intimate. The concert began. The music washed over Arthur, a wave of sound that resonated deep within his chest, in the very heart that wasn't his own. He found himself captivated, not just by the technical skill, but by the raw emotion pouring from the cello. He saw, in Clara's rapt expression, a reflection of Daniel's passionate spirit. Tears welled in his eyes, a mixture of grief for Daniel and a dawning understanding of the life he'd inherited. During the intermission, Clara found him leaning against a wall, overwhelmed. "It's beautiful," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Clara nodded, her eyes shining. "He would have loved this. He played the cello, terribly." She chuckled, a bittersweet sound. "But with such passion." He looked at her, truly saw her. The shared sorrow, the unspoken understanding, forged a connection stronger than mere acquaintance. He saw in her face the same longing, the same ache of loss. He felt a pang of guilt, not just for inheriting Daniel's life, but for the life Daniel had been denied. I feel like I'm intruding," he confessed, the words tumbling out. "This is your life, your memories." Clara gently took his hand. "He wouldn't want you to feel that way. His heart, it lives on in you, Arthur. And sharing his memories, his passions, it's not intruding. It's a continuation." Her gaze held his, conveying a depth of empathy that startled him. The weight of his guilt lessened, replaced by a flicker of hope, a fragile ember of acceptance in the darkness. The concert resumed, but the music faded into the background as Arthur finally allowed himself to begin healing, to accept the impossible truth of his dual existence. The following days were a blur of shared silences and hesitant conversations. Arthur found himself drawn to Clara, their connection deepening with each shared memory, each echoing laugh that felt both familiar and utterly alien. He'd started sketching again, a dormant passion reawakened by Daniel's artistic spirit. His clumsy charcoal strokes mimicked the vibrant energy of Daniel's paintings he'd seen in Clara's apartment, a sun-drenched cottage overlooking a turbulent sea, a child's laughing face captured in fleeting motion. The scent of linseed oil, a fragrance he hadn't known before, now filled his studio, a poignant reminder of Daniel's life. One evening, sitting on Clara's porch, the salty air thick with the scent of sea spray and wood smoke from a crackling fire, Arthur shared a fragmented memory. It was a snippet of a melody, a haunting tune played on a worn cello. Clara's breath hitched. "That's Daniel's lullaby," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "He used to play it for me when we were children." Tears welled in Arthur's eyes. It wasn't just a memory. It was a feeling, a profound sense of connection that transcended the boundaries of his own life. He saw, in Clara's tear-filled eyes, the reflection of a shared sorrow, a bond forged not in blood, but in the echoing resonance of a heart that had lived twice. The silence stretched between them, filled only with the crackling fire and the whisper of the wind. It was a silence pregnant with grief, with understanding, with the weight of a life lived and a life inherited. The weight of this impossible inheritance pressed down on him. He needed to talk to Eleanor. The luxury of his penthouse felt colder than ever before, the polished surfaces reflecting a stark image of his own emotional distance. Eleanor, curled up on the sofa, looked up as he entered. Her face, usually composed, was etched with a weariness that mirrored his own. "I need to tell you something," he began, his voice a low rumble. He recounted his experiences, the memories, the discovery of Daniel, the connection with Clara. Eleanor listened, her expression shifting from initial disbelief to dawning comprehension, laced with hurt and confusion. The silence following his confession was heavier this time. It was a silence of shared trauma, of unspoken fears. Then, Eleanor spoke, her voice soft, laced with a fragile acceptance. "I never understood you, Arthur, but maybe you weren't entirely yourself." A single tear traced a path down her cheek. The unspoken understanding, a hesitant forgiveness, hung in the air. The shared grief, though born of different roots, found a common ground in the quiet understanding of a love tested and transformed. The following morning, sunlight, pale and hesitant, filtered through the sheer curtains of Arthur's penthouse. He woke with a start, the phantom echo of Daniel's lullaby still clinging to the edges of his mind. Eleanor was already awake, sitting at the breakfast bar, her back to him, a solitary cup of tea steaming in front of her. The silence felt thick, heavy with the unspoken aftermath of last night's confession. He approached cautiously, the polished marble floor cold beneath his bare feet. The scent of freshly brewed coffee, usually a comforting aroma, felt jarring today, a stark contrast to the lingering scent of wood smoke and sea salt from Clara's porch. "Eleanor," he began, his voice barely a whisper. She turned, her eyes, usually bright and sharp, were shadowed with fatigue, a vulnerability he'd rarely seen. "I'm processing," she murmured, her voice raspy. She picked up the cup, her hand trembling slightly. He sat opposite her, the distance between them a chasm filled with unspoken words and nascent understanding. The weight of his confession, the implications of a life lived twice, hung heavy in the air. "I know this is unbelievable," he said, his voice catching. "But the memories, they're not just memories. They feel like they are mine and yet not mine." Eleanor nodded slowly, her gaze fixed on the swirling tea in her cup. I'm trying to understand. Part of me still feels betrayed, but another part sees the pain in your eyes, the confusion." A hesitant silence followed, filled only with the clinking of her spoon against the porcelain cup. The sun, now higher in the sky, cast long shadows across the room, highlighting the dust motes dancing in the golden light. It was a fragile moment, a space of shared vulnerability. The coldness that had once defined their relationship seemed to melt away, replaced by a tentative understanding. I want to understand Daniel," Arthur finally said, his voice thick with emotion. "To understand his life, his loss?" Eleanor looked at him then, a flicker of empathy in her eyes, a hint of the woman he'd once married, lost beneath layers of emotional distance. "Perhaps," she said, her voice barely audible, "perhaps we can find that understanding together." The unspoken words, the tentative forgiveness, the shared grief. It was a beginning, a fragile seed of hope planted in the barren landscape of their fractured marriage. The journey ahead would be long and arduous, but for the first time, Arthur felt a glimmer of hope that perhaps, just perhaps, they could navigate it together. The salt spray stung Arthur's face as he stood beside Clara on the windswept cliff overlooking the ocean. The gray sky mirrored the turmoil in his heart. He'd brought her to this spot, a place etched into his memory, Daniel's memory. A memory now inexplicably his own. The wind whipped Clara's hair around her face, mirroring the wildness of her grief. A grief he now understood with a bone-deep ache. "He loved this place," Clara whispered, her voice barely audible above the crashing waves. Tears streamed down her face, leaving tracks through the grime on her cheeks. The raw emotion resonated within Arthur, a painful echo of his own burgeoning sorrow. He reached out, hesitantly at first, then with a growing certainty, placing a comforting hand on her arm. The contact sent a jolt through him, a shared current of grief binding them together. The touch wasn't just physical. It was a communion of souls, a silent acknowledgement of their shared loss. I remember it," Arthur said, his voice thick with emotion. "The smell of the sea, the feel of the wind, the sound of the waves. It's as vivid as if I were here with him. Clara leaned into his touch, a small, almost imperceptible movement that spoke volumes. The shared grief softened the edges of her anger. The anger he'd initially perceived as a barrier, a wall erected to protect herself from the pain. Now he saw it as a shield protecting a heart broken beyond repair. "He used to paint here," she said, her voice steadier now, capturing the light, the shadows, the wildness of it all. He said it reflected his soul. Arthur looked out at the turbulent sea, the churning water a visual representation of the emotional maelstrom raging within him. He was beginning to understand the depth of Daniel's life, a life that now felt inextricably woven with his own. The merging wasn't just of memories. It was a merging of souls, a profound and unsettling transformation. The sun peeked through the clouds, casting a shaft of light across the turbulent sea, a fragile ray of hope amidst the storm. It was a small thing, but in that moment, amidst the shared grief and the raw emotion, Arthur felt a shift within himself, a flicker of acceptance, a tentative step towards embracing the complicated truth of his dual existence. The journey was far from over, but in the shared silence, broken only by the relentless rhythm of the waves, Arthur found a strange comfort, a sense of companionship in the face of the impossible. The sterile scent of antiseptic still clung to Arthur, a phantom reminder of the operating room. He sat in Clara's small, sun-drenched kitchen, the aroma of brewing coffee a stark contrast. Sunlight streamed through the window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air, a poignant ballet of impermanence. Clara, her eyes still red-rimmed, placed a mug before him. Her hand trembled slightly as she did so. "Thank you," Arthur murmured, his voice rough. The shared grief of the clifftop lingered, a heavy weight in his chest. He swirled the coffee, the warmth a small comfort against the chill that had settled deep within him. "He loved this time of year," Clara said softly, her gaze drifting to a faded photograph on the mantelpiece. Daniel, laughing, his arm around a young girl. Arthur recognized the girl as Clara, her face younger, less weathered by grief. I can feel it," Arthur replied, the words catching in his throat. He didn't just remember the seaside cottage. He felt the sun on his skin, the salt spray on his lips, the warmth of Daniel's hand on his shoulder. It was a visceral memory, a phantom limb sensation of a life that was both his and not his. A comfortable silence settled between them, punctuated only by the gentle hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of an old clock on the wall. Arthur watched Clara, her quiet strength both inspiring and heartbreaking. He saw the resilience beneath the surface, the determination to carry on, to honor Daniel's memory. He saw a reflection of himself. He wanted to exhibit his work in the city, Clara finally said, her voice barely above a whisper, breaking the silence. He'd been working on a new series, Paintings of the Sea, like the ones he did here. She gestured towards the photograph, her eyes filling with unshed tears. Arthur's heart ached. He understood now, with a clarity that bordered on pain, the magnitude of Daniel's dreams now inextricably linked to his own. He felt a surge of guilt, a responsibility he hadn't anticipated, a legacy he was unprepared to inherit. He reached for Clara's hand, his touch tentative yet firm. "I want to help," he said, his voice unwavering despite the tremor in his heart. "I want to finish what he started." The words felt both terrifying and liberating. He was Arthur, yes, but he was also Daniel, and the life that lay ahead would be a fusion of both their identities, a testament to a life lived and a life yet to be lived. The journey was far from over, but he was finally ready to walk it, hand in hand with the sister of the man whose heart now beat within him. The sterile hospital hallway felt miles away. Sunlight warmed Arthur's face as he sat in Clara's cottage, the scent of salt and seaweed a stark contrast to the antiseptic smell that still clung to his clothes. Clara's hands, roughened by years of work, moved deftly, arranging Daniel's paintings on the easel. Each brushstroke, vibrant and full of life, seemed to pulse with a familiar energy. Arthur felt a pang of something akin to ownership, a strange possessive instinct he couldn't quite explain. He loved this light, Clara murmured, her voice husky with unshed tears. She pointed to a painting of a stormy sea, the colors swirling with untamed energy. He said it captured the soul of the ocean. Arthur examined the painting, a familiar ache resonating within his chest. He wasn't just looking at a picture. He felt the wind whipping through his hair, the spray of the waves against his face, the raw power of the storm mirroring the turmoil in his own soul. It was Daniel's memory, undeniably, yet profoundly his own. He cleared his throat, the sound raspy and unfamiliar. I understand, he said, his voice thick with emotion. He wanted to tell her everything about the memories, the transplant, the impossible connection. But the words seemed to catch in his throat, choked by a wave of grief that wasn't entirely his own. Clara turned, her eyes red-rimmed but resolute. He was planning an exhibition in the city, she said, her voice quiet but firm. He'd been working on a new series, Paintings of the Coast, inspired by this place. She gestured towards the window, the vast expanse of the ocean stretching before them, a canvas reflecting the boundless horizon of Arthur's own uncertain future. The weight of Daniel's unfinished dreams settled heavily upon him, a responsibility as profound as it was daunting. It was more than just finishing Daniel's work. It was carrying on his legacy, his spirit, a part of himself he couldn't deny. Arthur reached out, his hand covering Clara's. Her skin was cool beneath his touch, a contrast to the warmth of his own hand, now infused with the memories, the emotions, the very essence of another life. "I'll do it," he said, his voice unwavering despite the tremor in his heart. "I'll finish his work." The words were a promise, a vow, a declaration of a life intertwined, a destiny shared, a future forged in the heart of grief and the embers of a life reborn. The journey ahead was uncharted, uncertain, and filled with the weight of two lives lived and one yet to be lived. Yet, in Clara's unwavering gaze, he found a strength that wasn't his own, a strength he knew he would need. The city lights blurred through the rain-streaked window of the gallery. Inside, the air hummed with hushed voices and the clinking of champagne glasses. Clara, elegant in a black dress, stood beside Arthur, her hand resting lightly on his arm, a silent gesture of support. The exhibition, a testament to Daniel's life, was a vibrant explosion of color and emotion. Arthur, however, felt a hollowness beneath the surface excitement. He watched people linger before Daniel's paintings, captivated by the stormy seas and sun-drenched coastlines, and a profound sense of loss washed over him. It was a bittersweet victory. "They're beautiful, aren't they?" Clara whispered, her voice barely audible above the low murmur of the crowd. Arthur nodded, his throat tight. He could almost feel Daniel's presence, the ghost of his touch on the brush, the intensity of his gaze capturing the essence of the ocean's soul. The shared memories, once a source of confusion and fear, now felt like a sacred trust. He was Daniel's custodian, his legacy. A woman approached, her eyes drawn to one particular canvas, a portrait of a laughing child with bright, curious eyes. "This one? It's breathtaking," she breathed, her voice laced with emotion. "It reminds me of my son years ago." Arthur felt a familiar pang, sharp and sudden, as if the woman's words stirred a sleeping memory, a memory not entirely his own, but undeniably woven into the fabric of his being. He saw, fleetingly, a similar laughing child, his own perhaps, but his mind couldn't grasp the connection fully, the time blurred and indistinct. Clara gently squeezed his arm. "It captures the pure joy of life," she said, her voice soft but firm. "Something Daniel always cherished." The words hung in the air, a silent acknowledgement of the complex emotions swirling within him: Daniel's joy, his own sorrow, a grief that transcended time and identity. Later, as the gallery emptied, Arthur found himself standing alone before Daniel's final painting, a breathtaking sunset over the ocean. The colors were vivid, fiery, and yet imbued with a sense of peaceful resolution. He saw himself in it now, the ocean's turbulence mirroring his inner struggle, the sunset symbolizing the calm that finally settled after the storm. He felt a deep sense of peace settle over him, a sense of belonging he had never experienced before, a sense of peace that belonged to him, yet was also undeniably Daniel's. He had begun to live a life that was their shared tapestry, a testament to the extraordinary bond forged through memory, loss, and the enduring power of love. The journey had been long, but in this shared life, Arthur knew he finally found his way. The sterile scent of the hospital still clung to Arthur, even after weeks of residing in his opulent home. He sat on the balcony, the late afternoon sun warming his face, a half-finished sketch in his lap, a stormy sea, mirroring the turmoil within. Clara's visit had been both exhilarating and devastating. Sharing Daniel's memories, the laughter of a child on a Cornish beach, had been profoundly moving, a shared past suddenly tangible. But the void remained, a constant ache. Eleanor entered, her footsteps hesitant on the polished stone floor. She carried a steaming mug, the aroma of chamomile a gentle counterpoint to the ocean's harshness in Arthur's drawing. "I found this in Daniel's things," she said softly, handing him a small, worn wooden box. Inside, nestled amongst faded velvet, was a child's painted seashell, astonishingly similar to one Arthur vaguely remembered from his own, or rather Daniel's, childhood. It's beautiful," Arthur whispered, his voice catching. The weight of the shell felt heavy in his hand, laden with unspoken history. He looked up at Eleanor, seeing a flicker of understanding in her eyes, a softening of the hard lines etched there by suspicion and hurt. "I'm still processing everything," he admitted, his gaze drifting back to the sea. "The memories, the guilt, the feeling of it not being entirely mine." Eleanor sat beside him, her hand brushing his lightly. "It's not just yours, Arthur," she said gently. "It's yours and Daniel's. It's his legacy, and now part of yours." The words, though simple, held a depth that surprised him. He realized the unspoken acceptance, the profound shift in their relationship. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the garden. The once distant chasm between them felt smaller, bridged by shared grief, shared history. A new shared future, still uncertain, but no longer terrifying. The shell, a tiny tangible link, now held the promise of a life rebuilt, piece by piece, from the fragments of two hearts. The storm in his drawing still raged, but now a fragile dawn peeked over the horizon. The following weeks were a blur of therapy sessions, medical consultations, and hushed conversations with Clara. Arthur's opulent home, once a symbol of his isolated wealth, now felt strangely empty, the silence punctuated by the rhythmic tick-tock of a grandfather clock inherited from whom? He wasn't sure anymore. The line between his life and Daniel's continued to blur, a watercolor painting bleeding its colors across the canvas of his existence. One evening, rain lashed against the tall windows of his study, mirroring the tempest within. Clara sat opposite him, a steaming mug warming her hands. The fire crackled merrily, casting flickering shadows that danced across her face, highlighting the strength and compassion in her eyes. She held a worn leather-bound journal, its pages filled with Daniel's spidery handwriting and vibrant sketches. "He wrote about you, Arthur," she said softly, her voice barely audible above the storm's roar. "Not directly, of course, but the intensity of his emotions, the longing in his words. It's as if he sensed something, someone he couldn't quite grasp." Arthur reached for the journal, his fingers tracing the faded ink. He felt a familiar pang of guilt, a deep-seated ache he couldn't quite explain. He loved life," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "A passion I never knew." Clara nodded, her gaze meeting his. "He loved the sea, the way the light danced on the water. He loved painting, capturing those fleeting moments of beauty. He loved fiercely." A single tear traced a path down her cheek, a testament to her enduring grief. He felt a surge of empathy, a profound connection to this woman who shared their past. He saw a reflection of Daniel in her eyes, a fierce determination, a tender heart. He wanted to reach out, to offer some comfort, but the words seemed inadequate, a pale imitation of the emotions swirling within him. The rain subsided, leaving behind a stillness that felt both profound and unsettling. Arthur closed the journal, the weight of Daniel's life pressing heavily on his chest. He looked at Clara, her face etched with a mixture of sadness and acceptance. In that shared silence, a profound understanding passed between them, a silent acknowledgement of their intertwined destinies, forged in the crucible of grief and the miracle of a transplanted heart. The future remained uncertain, a vast ocean still to navigate, but together, they would face it, guided by the echoes of a life lived and a love that transcended death. The scent of lilies, Eleanor's favorite, hung heavy in the air, a stark contrast to the sterile smell of antiseptic that still clung to Arthur's clothes. He sat across from her in the sun-drenched conservatory, the stained glass windows casting kaleidoscopic patterns on the polished mahogany table. Eleanor, usually impeccably composed, looked fragile, her usual sharp edges softened by a weariness that mirrored his own. Silence stretched between them, thick and uncomfortable, broken only by the gentle chirping of unseen birds. I found something," Arthur began, his voice hesitant, his gaze fixed on the intricate patterns in the glass. He pushed a worn photograph across the table. It showed Daniel, young and vibrant, laughing on a windswept beach, his arm around a laughing girl. Eleanor picked up the photo, her fingers tracing the lines of Daniel's face. A flicker of something, regret, understanding, crossed her features. "He was happy," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken emotions. Arthur nodded, his throat tight with emotion. "Clara told me about his life, about his paintings, his love for the sea. It's like a life I never lived, yet somehow I feel it deeply." He paused, searching for the right words. "It's more than just memories, Eleanor. It's like a part of him lives inside me." Eleanor looked up, her eyes filled with a mixture of sorrow and dawning acceptance. I understand now," she said quietly. "The changes, the passion. It wasn't just some midlife crisis." She reached across the table, her hand covering his. The touch was gentle, surprising in its warmth. "I was so afraid of losing you, Arthur. But maybe I was losing you already, long before the transplant." Tears welled in her eyes, but she didn't brush them away. A fragile hope bloomed in Arthur's chest, a small flower pushing through the barren earth of his grief. The sun, setting outside, cast long shadows across the room, painting the conservatory in shades of orange and gold, a visual representation of the tentative warmth beginning to seep into their relationship. The future remained uncertain, but for the first time since the transplant, Arthur felt a glimmer of peace. He squeezed Eleanor's hand, a silent acknowledgement of their shared journey, their intertwined fates. The weight of Daniel's life still pressed upon him, but it was no longer a crushing burden. It was a shared inheritance, a legacy he was beginning to understand and, tentatively, embrace. The salty tang of the sea air, a scent Arthur now recognized as intimately familiar, filled his lungs. He stood with Clara on the windswept beach, the exact spot in Daniel's photograph. The gray sky mirrored the storm brewing inside him. He'd brought her Daniel's worn sketchbook, its pages filled with vibrant charcoal sketches of the coastline, mirroring the very view before them. Clara traced a finger along a swirling line, a sketch of crashing waves. "He loved this place," she whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears. The wind whipped her hair across her face, mirroring the turmoil in Arthur's own heart. I feel it too," Arthur confessed, his voice barely audible above the crashing waves. He wasn't just remembering. He was feeling the raw, passionate energy Daniel had poured into these sketches, into this very place. The emotional weight was almost unbearable. Clara turned to him, her eyes reflecting the gray sky. "It's like he's showing you his soul," she said softly, her gaze unwavering. "And a part of his soul is now yours." He nodded, unable to speak. The realization hung between them, heavy and profound. It wasn't just fragmented memories. It was a complete, visceral connection to another life, another heart. He felt the echo of Daniel's laughter, the ghost of his touch, the lingering warmth of his passionate spirit. The setting sun cast long shadows across the sand, painting the scene in hues of orange and purple. The beauty was overwhelming, yet tinged with an unbearable sadness. Arthur looked at Clara, at the strength in her face, the acceptance in her eyes. In that moment, he felt less alone, less burdened by the weight of two lives. He had found a solace in this shared grief, a beacon in the storm. This was the beginning of his journey to understanding, to integrating this new reality into his own being. His own identity, once a solid fortress, was now a landscape under construction, reshaped by grief, by memory, by a love that defied the boundaries of life and death. The wind howled, a mournful symphony accompanying the unspoken words that hung heavy in the air. The future was still uncertain, a path yet to be forged through the shifting sands of memory and loss. But for the first time, Arthur felt a glimmer of hope amidst the chaos. The sterile scent of antiseptic clung to Arthur like a second skin, a stark contrast to the salty tang of the sea air that still haunted his senses. He sat in Dr. Ramirez's office, the familiar weight of Daniel's memories pressing down. The doctor's concerned gaze mirrored the turmoil within him. "The tests are inconclusive, Arthur," Dr. Ramirez said gently, his voice a low rumble. "But the cellular changes, they're unprecedented. We're still learning." Arthur ran a hand through his hair, the gesture betraying his anxiety. "Learning what? That I'm slowly becoming someone else?" "Not exactly," Dr. Ramirez corrected, choosing his words carefully. "It's more a merging, a blending of identities. Your brain is integrating Daniel's memories, his emotional responses. It's as if his life is imprinted on yours." The image of Clara's face flashed in his mind, her eyes filled with a mixture of sorrow and understanding. He'd confided in her about his unsettling experiences, finding solace in her quiet strength, a connection born from shared grief. He'd shown her the sketch of the beach, the one that felt so palpably his. "Clara, she understands," Arthur mumbled, more to himself than the doctor. "She sees it, feels it." Dr. Ramirez nodded. "That's significant. It suggests a deeper level of integration than we initially anticipated. The emotional bond you're forming with her. It's almost as if Daniel is reaching out through you." A wave of profound sadness washed over Arthur. The thought of Daniel's lost life, now inextricably woven with his own, felt both a gift and a heavy burden. The weight of two lives, two hearts beating in his chest, pressed heavily on him. "I miss him," Arthur whispered, the words catching in his throat. "I didn't even know him," and yet, he trailed off, unable to articulate the complex tapestry of emotions swirling within him. Guilt, grief, a strange, unexpected empathy. The doctor's silence was a comforting presence. The soft hum of the office equipment seemed to fade as Arthur focused on the depth of his feelings. His identity was no longer solely his own. It was a shared inheritance, a complex legacy passed down not through blood, but through a beating heart. The journey ahead was uncertain, but he was no longer alone in navigating it. He had Clara and perhaps, in a strange way, Daniel himself. The coastal wind whipped Arthur's hair across his face as he stood on the cliff overlooking the churning sea. The salty spray stung his eyes, mirroring the tears welling up inside. He clutched the worn, leather-bound journal in his hands, Daniel's handwriting a ghostly script under his trembling fingers. The pages chronicled a life vibrant and full, a stark contrast to his own sterile existence before the transplant. He'd found this spot, described in detail within the journal, a place Daniel called his sanctuary. The exact shade of gray in the cliffs, the particular slant of the sun hitting the waves. It was all eerily familiar, a deep echo in his soul. Clara arrived silently, her presence as calming as the rhythmic crash of the waves. She didn't speak, merely placed a comforting hand on his arm. The shared grief hung heavy in the air, thick and palpable like the sea mist rolling in from the horizon. "It's him," Arthur finally whispered, his voice hoarse with emotion. He didn't need to explain. Clara understood. She knew the weight of the memories he carried, the ghost of Daniel that lived and breathed within him. "I see him in you, Arthur," Clara replied softly, her voice barely audible above the wind. "His passion, his love for this place. It's all there." He showed her the sketch he'd made, a near-perfect replica of the scene before them, a drawing he'd inexplicably felt compelled to create. The lines flowed effortlessly from his hand, a skill he'd never possessed. Clara's eyes widened. "It's amazing," she breathed, a catch in her voice. He would have loved this. A profound sadness settled over them, a shared mourning for a life lost, yet somehow preserved. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery hues of orange and purple. The beauty of the sunset was bittersweet, a stark reminder of the fragility of life and the enduring power of memory. As the darkness deepened, the weight of two lives settled upon Arthur's shoulders. He felt the profound loss of Daniel, a loss he hadn't earned yet deeply felt, intertwined with a quiet, burgeoning hope. He had found a connection, a peace in sharing this grief with Clara. More than that, he sensed a potential for a new beginning, a chance to honor Daniel's memory by living a life filled with the passion and vibrancy that had been missing from his own. The sea continued to roar, a constant reminder of both the power of nature and the enduring strength of the human heart. The sterile scent of antiseptic still clung to Arthur, a stark contrast to the salty tang of the sea air lingering from his visit to Daniel's sanctuary. He sat in his opulent study, the polished mahogany desk a cold island in the vast, echoing room. Eleanor entered, her footsteps muted by the thick carpet. She carried a single, wilting white rose, a fragile offering in the face of the storm brewing between them. "I found this in your coat pocket," she said, her voice soft, yet laced with a weariness that mirrored his own. The rose, a symbol of Daniel's life, felt heavy in her hand, a silent acknowledgement of the shared grief, the impossible bond. Arthur took the rose, its delicate petals crumbling against his fingers. He met Eleanor's gaze, a flicker of something akin to understanding passing between them. The weeks had been a blur of conflicting emotions, guilt, grief, a strange, burgeoning sense of purpose. The initial suspicion had softened, replaced by a hesitant acceptance, a shared journey through uncharted emotional territory. I went to see Clara again," Arthur confessed, his voice barely a whisper. The weight of his unspoken words hung in the air. He'd confided in Clara about the burgeoning artistic talent he'd discovered within himself, a talent undeniably Daniel's. She'd responded with a gentle understanding, a sisterly acceptance that had eased the turmoil in his heart. Eleanor nodded, a subtle shift in her posture, a silent acknowledgement of the depth of Arthur's transformation. The icy wall between them had begun to crumble, revealing a space for something new, something unexpected to grow. The shared pain, the shared mystery of Daniel's life, had forged an uneasy truce, a fragile bridge built across the chasm of their fractured marriage. The silence stretched between them, filled only with the quiet hum of the house, the gentle ticking of a grandfather clock in the hallway. It was a silence filled with unspoken words, with the weight of shared grief, and with a fragile hope for a future neither had anticipated. The white rose, a symbol of a life lost and a life transformed, lay on the desk, a silent testament to the intricate tapestry of their lives, forever intertwined. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the sprawling grounds of Arthur's estate. He stood by the reflecting pool, the cool water a stark contrast to the burning intensity of his emotions. He'd spent the day poring over Daniel's journals, the vibrant sketches and passionate prose a haunting echo of a life lived fully, a life he now shared. A tremor ran through him, a phantom pain in his chest, a visceral reminder of the heart beating within him, Daniel's heart. Eleanor found him there, her presence a quiet intrusion on his solitude. She didn't speak immediately, simply stood beside him, watching the ripples spread across the still water. The silence between them was heavy, laden with unspoken words and the weight of their shared grief. Finally, Eleanor spoke, her voice low and measured. "Clara called. She She wants you to see something." The mention of Clara sent a jolt through Arthur. Their connection had deepened in recent weeks, a bond forged in shared sorrow and the strange, inexplicable kinship they felt. He nodded, his gaze still fixed on the water. "I know. I'm ready." The words were a confession, an admission of the profound shift within him, a surrender to the merging of identities that was both terrifying and strangely liberating. He felt Eleanor's hand brush his arm, a brief, fleeting touch that spoke volumes. He turned to her, seeing in her eyes not suspicion or anger, but a flicker of understanding, a quiet acceptance of the impossible truth. The cold distance that had defined their marriage was melting away, replaced by something raw, something real, forged in the crucible of shared loss and the unsettling reality of cellular memory. The rose, a pale ghost of a memory, seemed to bloom again in his mind, a symbol of their shared journey. The path ahead remained uncertain, but for the first time, they were walking it together. The drive to Clara's was a blur, the familiar landscape of rolling hills and scattered farmhouses oddly muted. Arthur felt a dull ache behind his eyes, a constant thrumming that mirrored the unsettling rhythm of his own heart. Eleanor's silence was a comforting weight beside him, a stark contrast to the swirling chaos within him. He glanced at her, catching the subtle tremor in her hand resting on the gear shift. The fear was still there, he knew, but softened now by a tentative acceptance. Clara's cottage was nestled amongst wildflowers, their vibrant hues jarring against the gray weight in Arthur's soul. The air, thick with the scent of honeysuckle and damp earth, offered a brief respite from the emotional storm raging inside him. Clara greeted them at the door, her embrace warm and surprisingly familiar. Her eyes, the same startling blue as the ones that haunted his dreams, held a depth of empathy that brought a lump to his throat. "I found something in Daniel's old sketchbook," Clara said, her voice hushed, leading them to a small, sun-drenched room. The scent of linseed oil and charcoal hung heavy in the air. She opened the worn leather-bound book, revealing a charcoal sketch of a rose. Not just any rose, but a rose identical to the one that had repeatedly surfaced in Arthur's fragmented memories. A pale, almost ethereal bloom with a delicate, spiraling stem. Arthur gasped, a choked sound escaping his lips. It was undeniably the same rose, the same delicate curve of the petals, the same graceful sweep of the stem. A wave of dizzying recognition washed over him, a visceral confirmation of the impossible connection to Daniel. He felt Eleanor's hand on his arm, a silent acknowledgement of the profound impact of this shared moment. "It was his favorite," Clara whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "He drew it everywhere, on scraps of paper, in his journals, even on napkins in cafes." The weight of shared loss hung heavy in the air, punctuated only by the soft scratching of a bird outside the window. Arthur looked at the drawing, then at Clara, then at Eleanor. The confusion hadn't vanished, but it was beginning to coalesce into something akin to understanding. Painful, beautiful understanding. The rose, a symbol of a life lived and a life now irrevocably intertwined with his own. The truth, however unsettling, was beginning to bloom. The weight of shared loss settled like a shroud. The scent of linseed oil and honeysuckle mingled, a strange perfume of grief and memory. Arthur traced the delicate lines of the charcoal rose, the paper rough beneath his fingertips. It wasn't just a drawing. It was a key, unlocking a door to a life he'd never lived, yet felt intimately. He felt Eleanor's hand tighten on his arm, a silent question hanging in the air. "He used to say it represented resilience," Clara murmured, her voice catching. Sunlight slanted through the window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the golden beams. It felt like a scene from one of Daniel's paintings, vibrant yet tinged with melancholy. "He drew it after everything." Arthur's throat tightened. He understood. The rose, a symbol of enduring beauty amidst hardship, a stubborn bloom pushing through the cracks of a broken heart. It was a perfect reflection of Daniel's spirit, a spirit he now carried within him. I remember it," Arthur whispered, the words catching in his throat. The memory wasn't a vivid image, more a feeling, the soft texture of the petals, the faint perfume, a sense of profound peace amidst chaos. I remember seeing it somewhere, a silence stretched, heavy with unspoken emotions. Eleanor squeezed his arm, her touch conveying a silent understanding that transcended words. The suspicion in her eyes had softened, replaced by a weary acceptance of the impossible. This wasn't just a case of bizarre medical anomaly. It was a profound merging of souls, a testament to the enduring power of the human heart. Clara moved to the window, her gaze drifting to the rolling hills beyond. "He loved this place," she said softly. "He'd spend hours sketching, painting, finding inspiration in the simplest things." Arthur looked at her, at Eleanor, at the charcoal rose. He saw not just a shared memory, but a shared future, a path forged through grief and acceptance, leading to a life he was only beginning to understand. His own life and Daniel's, intertwining like the delicate petals of that haunting rose. The impossible truth bloomed, bitter and beautiful, in the heart of the cottage. The journey ahead would be challenging, he knew, but it would be one he wouldn't face alone. He had Eleanor's tentative hand, Clara's unwavering support, and the lingering ghost of Daniel's artistic spirit guiding him. The rose was a promise, a whisper of a new beginning. The sterile scent of antiseptic still clung to Arthur's clothes, a stark contrast to the earthy aroma of the cottage garden. He stood beside Clara, the late afternoon sun painting long shadows across the uneven flagstones. Eleanor remained by the window, her gaze distant, lost in the rolling hills. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken words and the weight of shared grief. Clara broke the silence, her voice low and husky. "Daniel, he'd often sit here, sketching. He loved the way the light fell on the roses." She gestured towards a weathered easel, half hidden beneath a climbing rose bush. A half-finished charcoal sketch lay propped against it, a single, defiant rose blooming against a backdrop of stormy skies. Arthur felt a strange pull, a recognition that transcended simple memory. He reached out, his fingers brushing the rough texture of the charcoal, the subtle grain of the paper. A wave of emotion, both sorrow and a poignant sense of familiarity, washed over him. It wasn't a visual memory, but an emotional imprint, a phantom touch of a life he'd never lived. He said it represented perseverance, he whispered, his voice trembling. The words felt both foreign and intimately his own. He looked at Clara, his gaze searching. He told me that." Clara's eyes widened, a flicker of surprise giving way to a slow, understanding smile. "He did," she said softly. "He often spoke of a resilience that bloomed even amidst hardship." She paused, her eyes misting over. "He needed that." Eleanor finally turned, her expression unreadable. The suspicion had largely faded, replaced by a weary sadness. She walked towards them, her steps deliberate, her posture suggesting a fragile truce. I understand," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The words hung in the air, acknowledging not just Arthur's impossible memories, but the chasm that had opened up between them, a chasm that was slowly, painfully, beginning to heal. The weight of their shared experience, the impossible convergence of their lives, bound them together in a new, fragile understanding. The rose, a symbol of enduring strength, stood as a testament to their combined journey, a journey through loss, acceptance, and the blossoming of an unexpected, yet profound connection. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting the cottage in a warm, golden glow, a silent promise of a future yet to be written. The sterile white of the laboratory contrasted sharply with the vibrant hues of the memory projected onto the screen. Daniel laughing, paint splattered across his denim shirt. Arthur watched, a cold dread tightening his chest. Dr. Albright, a gaunt figure with eyes that held a chilling detachment, explained the process with clinical precision, his words devoid of empathy. "Cellular memory transfer, a breakthrough, Mr. Reeves, though admittedly ethically questionable." The casual way he dismissed the ethical implications sent a shiver down Arthur's spine. Clara sat beside him, her hand resting reassuringly on his. Her silent support was a lifeline in this sterile, unsettling environment. The air hummed with the low thrum of machinery, a stark counterpoint to the laughter echoing from the screen. Arthur felt a visceral pang of grief, a raw ache in his chest that transcended mere memory. It was Daniel's grief, his joy, his very essence, resonating within him. "This wasn't accidental," Clara said, her voice low and steady, breaking the suffocating silence. "This was a deliberate experiment, a violation." Her eyes, usually bright with compassion, were now steely with righteous anger. The fragile truce between them solidified into a shared purpose. This wasn't just about Arthur's fragmented memories anymore. It was about justice for Daniel, for the countless others who might have been victims of Dr. Albright's ambition. Arthur felt a surge of strength, a new resolve born from grief and outrage. He looked at Dr. Albright, his eyes blazing with a newfound intensity. "You'll pay for this," he said, his voice barely a whisper, yet carrying the weight of a lifetime's unspoken resentments and now Daniel's. The scientist smirked, a chilling display of callous indifference. The battle lines were drawn, the fight for justice beginning in the cold, sterile heart of a scientific betrayal. The weight of their shared journey, the impossible convergence of their lives, had forged an unbreakable bond, a commitment to expose the truth, no matter the cost. The sterile white of the lab seemed to dim, overshadowed by the blazing fire of their righteous anger. The sterile scent of antiseptic clung to Arthur's clothes, a stark contrast to the earthy smell of Daniel's paints he'd smelled at Clara's house. He sat across from Dr. Albright, the scientist's smug smile a grotesque mockery of the devastation he'd wrought. Sunlight, slicing through the tall, narrow windows of the interrogation room, illuminated the dust motes dancing in the air, a silent, ethereal ballet against the harsh reality of the situation. Clara's hand found his under the table, a silent promise of support. Her grip, firm yet gentle, anchored him. He squeezed back, the simple gesture a silent acknowledgement of their shared burden. "So, Mr. Reeves," Dr. Albright began, his voice a chillingly smooth baritone, "you understand the implications of your unique situation?" Arthur met his gaze, his own eyes burning with a cold fire. "I understand that you violated my life and Daniel's. You played God, and now we're paying the price." Dr. Albright chuckled, a sound devoid of humor. "Sentimentality, such a hindrance to progress. The research was groundbreaking." "Groundbreaking? You call stealing someone's life and memories groundbreaking?" Clara's voice was sharp, edged with controlled fury. Her usually compassionate eyes blazed with righteous anger. The room felt charged, the air thick with unspoken accusations. Arthur felt the familiar ache in his chest, a blend of Daniel's grief and his own outrage. He watched as Clara's knuckles whitened around his hand, her anger a fierce shield against the doctor's callous disregard. He saw the pain mirrored in her eyes, the same pain he felt in his own heart, a shared pain that transcended the boundaries of their individual lives. "This isn't about progress," Arthur said, his voice low and steady, each word carefully chosen. "It's about ethics, about respect, about the right to live your own life." He looked at Dr. Albright, his eyes reflecting the strength born from shared grief and righteous anger. "You'll face the consequences of your actions." The doctor's smile faltered for the first time. The smug confidence drained from his face, replaced by a flicker of something akin to fear. The silent tension in the room tightened, a palpable thing hanging in the air like smoke. The fight had begun. The fight for Daniel, for Arthur, and for the countless others whose lives had been unknowingly stolen. The sun, still streaming through the window, seemed to cast a long shadow over Dr. Albright, a shadow of the impending justice. The interrogation room felt colder now, the sunlight retreating as dusk settled. Dr. Albright's forced composure had crumbled, replaced by a simmering resentment. He tapped a manicured fingernail against the polished table, the sharp click echoing the growing tension. "You misunderstand," he hissed, his voice losing its smooth veneer. "This was a scientific breakthrough. The implications, The implications are that you violated human rights, Clara interrupted, her voice tight with controlled rage. The scent of her perfume, a blend of lilies and something subtly spicy, hung sharp in the air, a stark contrast to the sterile hospital smell. She met Albright's gaze, her eyes unwavering. You stole a life, Dr. Albright. You stole a part of Arthur, and you stole all of Daniel. Arthur felt a surge of protectiveness towards Clara, her fierce loyalty a balm to his own simmering anger. He reached across the table, his fingers brushing hers, a silent gesture of support. He saw a tear trace a path down her cheek, quickly wiped away. The shared pain, the unspoken understanding, solidified the bond between them. It wasn't just a part, Arthur said, his voice low and steady. He felt the familiar ache in his chest, a constant reminder of Daniel's presence within him, a bittersweet legacy. The metallic tang of blood, a phantom sensation from the surgery, lingered on his tongue. Daniel's laughter, his love for his sister, his passion for his art. These are not parts. They are the core of who he was. And you stole them. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. The only sound was the rhythmic ticking of a clock on the wall, each tick a hammer blow against the doctor's dwindling defenses. He looked from Arthur to Clara, his eyes darting nervously. The smugness was gone, replaced by fear, a fear that mirrored the desperation in Arthur's own heart, the desperate need for justice, for closure, for a future that wasn't defined by stolen memories. The legal battle ahead loomed, daunting, but the seed of hope, planted by their shared grief and righteous anger, had begun to sprout. The fight had begun and they were ready. The sterile scent of antiseptic clung to Arthur's clothes, a persistent reminder of the hospital's cold embrace. He sat across from Clara in a small, sun-drenched cafe, the warmth a stark contrast to the chilling events unfolding. Outside, the city hummed with life, a vibrant tapestry woven from car horns and distant sirens, a symphony of urban chaos that felt strangely comforting. Clara's hand, resting on the worn wooden table, trembled slightly. Her eyes, usually sparkling with life, held a shadowed weariness. "The lawyer says it's going to be a long fight," Clara whispered, her voice barely audible above the cafe's gentle murmur. Her words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken anxieties. Arthur reached across the table, his fingers gently covering hers. The contact sent a jolt of warmth through him, a shared understanding that transcended words. "We'll fight," he said, his voice firm despite the tremor in his own heart. "For Daniel, for the truth." He saw the flicker of hope in her eyes, a fragile flame against the backdrop of grief. The weight of Daniel's stolen life pressed heavily on them both, a shared burden forged in the crucible of injustice. The legal battle loomed, a formidable beast threatening to consume them, but their shared determination, fueled by a righteous anger and a profound sense of loss, served as a powerful shield. "I keep seeing things," Clara confessed, her voice catching, "fleeting glimpses, like fragments of memories, of Daniel and me as children." She paused, her gaze drifting to the bustling street. "It's as if a part of him is still here with me." Arthur understood the sentiment profoundly. Daniel's memories, his emotions, his very essence, were woven into the fabric of his own being. He felt a profound empathy for Clara, a kinship born from a shared trauma, a shared loss, a shared connection to Daniel's soul. The silence that followed was thick with unspoken emotions, grief, anger, resilience, and a fierce determination to fight for justice. The weight of the impending legal battle pressed down on them both, but in their shared sorrow and unwavering resolve, Arthur and Clara found a strength that would sustain them through the arduous journey ahead. The fight for justice had begun, and they were ready to face whatever lay in store. Together, the lawyer's words hung in the air, thick and suffocating. "The corporation, they have deep pockets, Mr. Hayes. This will be a protracted, expensive battle." Arthur felt a familiar chill crawl up his spine, a stark contrast to the warm afternoon sun streaming through the cafe window. The scent of freshly brewed coffee couldn't mask the metallic tang of fear clinging to the air. Clara's hand, still clasped in his, felt ice-cold. He squeezed gently, offering silent reassurance. He saw the tremor in her hand, felt the fragility of her hope, mirrored in the haunted look in her eyes. "We have the truth, Clara," he said, his voice a low rumble, attempting to mask his own rising apprehension. "And that's a powerful weapon." The cafe buzzed with the murmur of conversations, the clinking of cups, the rhythmic scrape of chairs. Yet, for Arthur and Clara, the world outside ceased to exist. Their small corner became a sanctuary of shared grief, a silent testament to the injustice they were fighting. He thought of Daniel, of his vibrant laughter, his passionate spirit, now silenced by a callous indifference. A wave of nausea threatened to overwhelm him. Clara's voice, barely a whisper, broke the silence. "I dreamt of him last night. The seaside cottage, the sunflowers. It was so vivid, so real." Tears welled in her eyes, tracing paths through the carefully applied makeup. He watched, helpless, as the grief threatened to consume her. He knew that feeling intimately. Daniel's memories, his emotions, weren't just echoes in Arthur's mind. They were a vibrant presence, a constant reminder of the life stolen and the injustice they battled. He drew her closer, offering the comfort only shared trauma could provide. The warmth of her presence, the scent of her perfume, a subtle blend of lavender and vanilla, was a grounding force, a reassuring anchor in the storm of their shared sorrow. "We'll find justice, Clara," he promised, his voice thick with emotion. "For Daniel, for ourselves." The words were more a vow to himself than to her, a declaration of his unwavering commitment to the fight ahead. The fight was far from over, but in that shared moment of grief and resilience, in the silent understanding that passed between them, they found the strength to face whatever lay ahead, together. The weight of the world, the burden of their shared loss, felt a little lighter, borne not alone but shoulder to shoulder, fueled by hope and a fierce, unwavering determination to win. The sterile scent of the hospital hallway was a stark contrast to the floral perfume clinging to Clara's clothes. Arthur watched her, her shoulders slumped, the vibrant energy he'd come to associate with Daniel now dimmed by exhaustion and grief. The lawyer's words echoed in his own mind, a chilling counterpoint to the rhythmic beeping of heart monitors. "They're powerful, Arthur?" Clara whispered, her voice barely audible above the muted hum of the hospital. Her eyes, usually bright and full of life, were clouded with a deep sadness that mirrored his own. He reached out, his fingers brushing against hers. The contact sparked a jolt of shared grief, a silent acknowledgement of their shared trauma. He squeezed her hand gently, offering silent reassurance. "We have evidence, Clara. Dr. Ramirez's notes, the inconsistencies in the donor records. It's all there." A flicker of hope ignited in her eyes, a fragile flame against the encroaching darkness of despair. "But they'll bury it under mountains of legal jargon. They'll spin this into something acceptable, something they can control." The weight of her words settled heavily on Arthur's chest. He knew she was right. The corporation Omnicorp had resources far beyond their reach. He pictured Dr. Albright's smug face, the cold glint in his eyes, the chilling detachment with which he described the experiment. The injustice was a physical weight, pressing down on him, threatening to suffocate him. He pulled her closer, the warmth of her body a stark contrast to the chill of the hospital corridor. The low hum of the fluorescent lights seemed to intensify, a discordant soundtrack to their silent struggle. He felt the tremor in her hand again, the fragility of her hope, a reflection of his own. He needed to be strong, for her, for Daniel, for the memory of the life stolen. "We won't let them," he said, his voice firm despite the turmoil within. "We'll fight. We'll expose them." The words were a promise, not just to Clara, but to himself, a pledge to honor the memory of Daniel's vibrant life. The fight was far from over, but in that shared moment of grief and resilience, in the silent understanding that passed between them, they found a renewed strength. They were not alone. They had each other. And they had the truth. The sterile hospital air hung heavy, a stark contrast to the memory of Daniel's seaside studio. Sunlight streaming through the windows, paintbrushes scattered across a vibrant canvas. Clara's hand, trembling slightly in Arthur's, felt fragile, a poignant reminder of their shared loss. "They'll silence us," she whispered, her voice catching. The fluorescent lights hummed, a relentless soundtrack to their despair. Arthur squeezed her hand, the firmness of his grip a counterpoint to the tremor in hers. He saw the flicker of fear in her eyes, a mirror of his own apprehension. Omnicorp's power loomed, a shadowy giant threatening to crush their fragile hope. Yet, a stubborn defiance burned within him, fueled by Daniel's memory, by the injustice of it all. "We have the truth, Clara," he said, his voice low but resolute. He thought of Dr. Ramirez's hushed confession, the guilt etched on his face, the stolen medical files tucked safely away. "We have the evidence to fight back." The weight of the fight pressed down, but the conviction in his words steadied Clara. The elevator doors pinged open, revealing a stark white hallway. The silence was broken only by the rhythmic thump of their footsteps. They reached Dr. Ramirez's office, the familiar scent of antiseptic stinging Arthur's nostrils. He felt a surge of anxious energy, a nervous anticipation that gnawed at him. This was it, the moment of reckoning. Dr. Ramirez's face was etched with worry, a stark contrast to his usual professional composure. "I've prepared everything," he whispered, handing Arthur a sealed envelope. "This could expose everything." His eyes held a mixture of fear and determination. Arthur knew this was a dangerous gamble, but the alternative silence was unacceptable. The fight had begun. The envelope felt cool and crisp against Arthur's palm, the weight of its contents a tangible representation of the risk they were taking. He glanced at Clara, her face pale but resolute, her eyes reflecting the flickering fluorescent lights. The sterile scent of the doctor's office, usually a source of unease, now felt strangely comforting, a familiar anchor in the storm brewing. "This is it," Dr. Ramirez whispered, his voice barely audible above the hum of the ventilation system. His usually meticulous hands trembled slightly as he adjusted his glasses. The guilt etched onto his face was a stark testament to the enormity of the conspiracy they were about to expose. Arthur opened the envelope, his fingers tracing the crisp edges of the documents within. Photographs, lab reports, emails. A meticulously compiled dossier detailing Omnicorp's unethical experiment, their callous disregard for human life. The evidence was irrefutable. A wave of nausea washed over him, the reality of their situation crashing down with the force of a tidal wave. He felt Clara's hand tighten on his, a silent expression of shared fear and determination. "They knew." Clara's voice was barely a breath, a mixture of horror and disbelief lacing her words. She pointed to a photograph, a blurry image of a young Daniel, strapped to a medical table. His eyes filled with a nameless terror. The image seared itself onto Arthur's memory, a visceral reminder of the sacrifice Daniel had made. A life stolen, a soul violated. "We need to act quickly," Arthur said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. He felt a surge of adrenaline, a potent cocktail of fear and anger fueling his resolve. This wasn't just about Daniel anymore. It was about justice, about preventing others from suffering the same fate. He looked at Ramirez, his eyes conveying a silent message of gratitude and shared purpose. The fight, as daunting as it was, had begun. The documents, their weight heavy with the truth, represented not just evidence, but a promise to Daniel, to Clara, and to all those whose lives had been touched by Omnicorp's ruthless ambition. The hum of the fluorescent lights seemed to intensify, a relentless undercurrent to the quiet determination building in the small, sterile office. Their next step was a calculated risk. The stakes were nothing less than their lives, and the lives of countless others. The air in the courtroom hung thick with anticipation, a palpable tension that vibrated against Arthur's skin. He sat beside Clara, her hand clasped tightly in his, a silent reassurance against the storm brewing. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, a stark counterpoint to the hushed whispers rippling through the gallery. Dr. Ramirez, his face etched with a mixture of guilt and defiance, sat a few feet away, his eyes fixed on the imposing figure of Mr. Silas Thorne, the CEO of Omnicorp, his face a mask of controlled fury. Thorne's lawyer, a polished shark in a tailored suit, launched into a series of objections, his voice a smooth, oily tide washing over the proceedings. Clara squeezed Arthur's hand, her knuckles white. The lawyer's words, carefully chosen to sow doubt and discredit the evidence, chipped away at Arthur's carefully constructed composure. He felt the familiar phantom ache in his chest, a visceral reminder of Daniel's loss, a physical manifestation of the grief that threatened to overwhelm him. "This is a blatant smear campaign," Thorne's lawyer boomed, his voice echoing through the silent courtroom. "A desperate attempt to capitalize on a tragic accident." His gaze swept over the assembled crowd, lingering on Arthur, a flicker of something akin to contempt in his eyes. Arthur felt a surge of anger, a heat rising in his chest, pushing back against the icy grip of fear. He met Thorne's gaze, his own eyes unwavering. He'd spent weeks poring over the evidence, living and breathing the details of Omnicorp's callous experiment, the chilling indifference they'd shown to human life. He wouldn't let them get away with it. Clara leaned closer, her voice a soft murmur against his ear. "Remember Daniel," she whispered, her words a lifeline in the suffocating atmosphere. The memory of Daniel's laughter, the vibrant colors of his paintings, the warmth of his smile, flooded back, bolstering his resolve. Dr. Ramirez, called to the stand, delivered his testimony with a quiet dignity, his words a damning indictment of Omnicorp's actions. His voice, though measured, resonated with a deep sense of remorse and a burning desire for justice. Each carefully chosen word landed like a punch, dismantling the lawyer's carefully constructed defense. As the testimony progressed, the weight of the evidence, the enormity of the injustice, became undeniable. Even Thorne's stony expression seemed to crack under the weight of the truth. The hum of the fluorescent lights faded into the background, replaced by the heavy silence of a courtroom reckoning with a terrible truth. The fight was far from over, but for the first time, Arthur felt a glimmer of hope. The courtroom air, thick with the scent of old wood and nervous sweat, crackled with unspoken accusations. Arthur felt Clara's hand, a comforting weight in his own, her knuckles bone-white against his skin. He watched Dr. Ramirez, his face etched with a weary sorrow, take the stand. The fluorescent lights buzzed, a discordant hum against the oppressive silence. Dr. Ramirez, Thorne's lawyer, a man whose smile never quite reached his cold eyes, began, his voice a silken blade. "You claim that Omnicorp's experimental procedure resulted in the transfer of cellular memory?" Dr. Ramirez nodded, his gaze unwavering. "Yes, the data, though incomplete, strongly suggests a transfer of neurological patterns associated with memory and emotion." His voice, though low, carried an undeniable weight of truth. A ripple of murmurs ran through the gallery. Arthur felt a knot tighten in his stomach. This was it, the moment of truth. He saw Thorne, his face a mask of controlled rage, and felt a surge of defiant energy. He wouldn't let this man, this symbol of corporate greed and indifference, escape justice. Clara squeezed his hand again, a silent affirmation of their shared struggle. He looked at her, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and determination, and found strength in her unwavering gaze. He thought of Daniel, of his laughter, his vibrant paintings, the life stolen too soon. That memory, vivid and sharp, fueled his resolve. Thorne's lawyer pressed on, his questions designed to cast doubt, to tear apart the carefully constructed case. But Dr. Ramirez held firm, his testimony clear, precise, devastating in its implications. Each answer was a blow, chipping away at the carefully constructed facade of corporate innocence. The lawyer's attempts to discredit the doctor only served to highlight the truth of his words. The room was heavy with the weight of unspoken accusations, of secrets laid bare. The silence was broken only by the rhythmic tick of the courtroom clock, each second a hammer blow against the wall of denial. Arthur knew, with a certainty that resonated deep within his soul, that justice was within reach. The fight was far from over, but the tide had begun to turn. He felt a surge of hope, a fragile but tenacious flame burning against the darkness. He looked at Clara, a silent promise passing between them, a promise to fight for Daniel, for the truth, for justice. The courtroom's hushed expectancy felt like a physical weight. Sunlight, fractured by the tall, arched windows, cast long shadows across the polished wood. Arthur felt Clara's hand, a lifeline in the suffocating atmosphere. He squeezed it, a silent promise of support. Dr. Ramirez's testimony, though meticulously documented, felt fragile, vulnerable to Thorne's slick legal maneuvering. The lawyer, a viper in a tailored suit, pressed on, his questions barbed and precise. "Doctor," the lawyer purred, his voice laced with false concern. "You're suggesting a complete transfer of personality? A wholesale replacement of one consciousness with another?" Dr. Ramirez, his face etched with the weariness of a long battle, met the lawyer's gaze. "Not a replacement, sir. A merging. The donor's cellular memory, intricately woven into the recipient's neurological pathways. The process is incompletely understood." He paused, his voice catching slightly. "But the evidence suggests a profound intertwining of identities." Arthur watched Thorne, his face a mask of carefully controlled fury. The man radiated an icy arrogance that chilled Arthur to the bone. This wasn't just about money. This was about control, about silencing the truth. A wave of nausea washed over him, a visceral reaction to the man's callous disregard for human life. He felt Clara's hand tighten in his, a silent acknowledgement of the shared burden. The lawyer continued his relentless assault, attempting to sow doubt, to exploit any crack in the doctor's carefully constructed testimony. But Ramirez held firm, his responses measured, his conviction unwavering. Each answer was a stone in a wall, building a fortress of truth against the tide of lies. The tension in the courtroom was palpable, a living entity breathing in the hushed whispers and the sharp intake of breaths. The clock ticked, each second a hammer blow against the fragile hope building in Arthur's heart. This wasn't just about Daniel's memory. It was about justice, about accountability, and deep within, a fierce determination took root. He wouldn't let them win. He wouldn't let Daniel's memory fade into oblivion. He wouldn't let them steal his life again. The courtroom air, thick with anticipation, tasted of dust and stale perfume. Sunlight, slicing through the grimy windows, illuminated motes dancing in the oppressive silence. Arthur felt Clara's hand, a comforting weight in his own. He squeezed it, a silent vow of solidarity against the looming shadow of Thorne's relentless cross-examination. Dr. Ramirez, his face etched with exhaustion, seemed to shrink under the lawyer's predatory gaze. Thorne's voice, smooth as polished marble, sliced through the silence. "Doctor, you claim this merging of identities is a verifiable medical phenomenon? Can you provide concrete, irrefutable proof?" The question hung in the air, a poisoned dart aimed at the heart of their case. Ramirez hesitated, a flicker of doubt crossing his weary features. He adjusted his glasses, the faint click echoing in the tense quiet. "The evidence is circumstantial, yes," he admitted, his voice low but steady. "But the convergence of cellular memory, neurological patterns, and shared emotional responses, the totality of the evidence points towards a unique and unprecedented phenomenon." Arthur watched Thorne, his face a mask of cold calculation. He saw a flicker of something else there, a hint of fear beneath the controlled facade. The man was arrogant, but he was also afraid. Afraid of the truth, afraid of exposure. The tension in the courtroom tightened, a palpable thing pressing down on Arthur's chest. He could feel Clara's hand trembling slightly within his. He leaned towards her, whispering, "It's all right. We've got this." Her eyes, though filled with apprehension, mirrored his quiet strength. That shared glance, a brief moment of silent communion, strengthened his resolve. This wasn't just about Daniel. It was about the sanctity of life, the integrity of medical ethics, and the terrifying potential for abuse hidden within the shadows of unchecked scientific ambition. He wouldn't let Thorne win. He wouldn't let them bury the truth. Not this time. He wouldn't let them steal another life. Thorne's relentless questioning continued, each word a hammer blow against their fragile hope. The courtroom, a stifling cage of polished wood and hushed whispers, felt colder than the winter wind howling outside. Arthur felt the tremor in Clara's hand intensify. He squeezed it tighter, the silent exchange a lifeline between them. Dr. Ramirez, his face pale and drawn, stood like a lone sentinel, defending the impossible. "But Doctor," Thorne pressed, his voice dripping with condescending skepticism, "there's no precedent for this. No scientific paper, no peer-reviewed study to support your extraordinary claims." Ramirez shifted, his gaze flickering to Arthur, then to Clara. Their unwavering belief was his only armor. "The very nature of this case, Mr. Thorne, precludes the existence of established precedents. We are dealing with uncharted territory, with the very boundaries of human understanding." His voice, though shaky, held a strength born of conviction. Arthur watched Thorne, the lawyer's arrogance a thin veneer over a rising panic. He saw the sweat beading on his forehead, the subtle tremor in his meticulously manicured hand. The truth, like a venomous serpent, was constricting Thorne's carefully crafted narrative. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the courtroom floor, highlighting the dust motes dancing in the golden light. The air grew thick with tension, a silent battle fought between the weight of evidence and the power of denial. Arthur felt a surge of anger, a potent cocktail of frustration and righteous fury. This wasn't just about Daniel. It was about the future, about protecting others from the horrors Thorne represented. He looked at Clara, her eyes reflecting the same fierce determination. Their shared grief, the bond forged in the crucible of loss and revelation, gave them strength. In that shared glance, Arthur knew they wouldn't back down. They would fight not just for justice, but for the memory of Daniel, for the sanctity of life itself. Thorne might have the law, but they had the truth. And the truth, Arthur knew, would ultimately prevail. The weight of the upcoming cross-examination felt less oppressive, replaced by a quiet, burning resolve. The courtroom air hung thick with the scent of old wood and nervous sweat. Sunlight, fractured by the stained glass window, cast kaleidoscopic patterns on the polished floor. Thorne, his smug facade momentarily cracked, leaned back, the silence amplifying the rhythmic tick-tock of the grandfather clock in the hall. Clara's hand, trembling slightly, remained clasped tightly in Arthur's. The pressure was a silent promise, a shared understanding of the battle ahead. "Dr. Ramirez," Thorne's voice, though quieter, held an edge of desperate control. "You claim cellular memory transfer is possible, yet the scientific community overwhelmingly refutes this fantastical notion." Ramirez, his face etched with fatigue, met Thorne's gaze directly. "Mr. Thorne," he began, his voice low and steady, "extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and in this case, the evidence is Arthur." He gestured subtly towards Arthur, his eyes conveying a complex blend of hope and apprehension. Arthur felt a surge of protectiveness towards the doctor, a man who had not only saved his life, but was now defending his very identity. He squeezed Clara's hand again, feeling the strength in her grip, a silent testament to their shared resilience. The next few hours were a blur of technical jargon, medical reports dissected and debated, the weight of the accusation pressing down on them like a physical force. Thorne, relentless in his attack, tried to discredit Ramirez's testimony, painting him as a rogue scientist, a fantasist chasing an impossible dream. But with each attempt, Ramirez's calm, measured responses chipped away at Thorne's carefully constructed narrative. A pivotal moment arrived when Clara stepped forward, her voice clear and strong, despite the tremor in her hands. She spoke of Daniel, not just as her brother, but as a vibrant, passionate soul. She described his love for the seaside cottage, his laughter echoing in the salt-laced air, the intricate details of his artwork mirroring the memories Arthur had shared. Her words were not just testimony. They were a poignant eulogy, a celebration of a life cruelly cut short. The courtroom, previously tense, fell silent, captivated by her raw grief and unwavering conviction. Thorne shifted uncomfortably, his carefully crafted composure showing cracks. The courtroom was no longer a battleground of legal arguments, but a space where the truth of a life, experienced and remembered, fought for its recognition. The weight of the evidence, the emotional resonance of Clara's words, the steadfastness of Ramirez's defense, all converged, forming an unbreakable chain linking Arthur's present to Daniel's past. The sun dipped lower, casting longer shadows, as the truth began to illuminate the darkness. The finality of the day's proceedings was near. The fight had just begun. The courtroom buzzed, a hive of hushed whispers and nervous energy. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. Arthur, his hand still clasped in Clara's, felt a tremor of anxiety. Thorne, the sleek, predatory lawyer, paced like a caged animal, his expensive suit unable to mask the sweat beading on his forehead. Dr. Ramirez, his face drawn and pale, sat rigidly, his gaze unwavering. And so, Thorne's voice, a smooth, cutting instrument, sliced through the tension. You claim this transference of memory is not only possible but proven in this case? Ramirez took a deep breath, the sound echoing in the sudden silence. The evidence, Mr. Thorne, speaks for itself. The memories, the emotional responses, the specific details, they are irrefutable. His gaze swept over Arthur, then to Clara, their shared grief a visible bond. Clara, her voice thick with unshed tears, recounted a memory, a shared laugh at a seaside cafe, a detail Arthur had independently described. The courtroom watched, captivated. The memory, once fragmented and alien to Arthur, now resonated with a painful clarity. It was a small detail, yet it held immense weight, a tangible link between two lives. The weight of the day pressed down on them. The accusations, the lies, the fight for justice. Arthur saw the exhaustion etched on Ramirez's face, the unwavering determination in Clara's eyes, the simmering anger barely contained in Eleanor's posture. Now seated behind them, her silent support a silent testament to her evolving understanding. Thorne, desperate, attempted to discredit Ramirez's research, his words laced with venom. But Ramirez, armed with irrefutable evidence, held his ground, his voice steady. The courtroom became a battleground not just of legal arguments, but of memories, of emotions, of two lives inextricably intertwined. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the courtroom floor as the final witness, a hesitant but determined junior researcher from Thorne's own lab, testified. His hushed testimony, detailing the unethical shortcuts and falsified data, shattered Thorne's carefully constructed defense. The truth, long suppressed, began to emerge, a painful but necessary revelation. In that moment, even the ticking clock seemed to pause, the silence heavy with the weight of revelation. The battle was far from over, but a critical victory had been won. The judge's gavel fell, a sharp crack in the suffocating silence. Arthur felt Clara's hand tighten in his. He looked at Eleanor, her face etched with a weariness that mirrored his own. But beneath it, a quiet strength had blossomed. The victory was bittersweet. Thorne, defeated, slumped in his chair, his arrogance replaced by a chilling emptiness. Later, in the hushed quiet of Clara's seaside cottage, the very cottage from Daniel's memories, Arthur sat by the window, the salty air carrying the scent of brine and distant seabirds. Clara made tea, the clinking of porcelain a fragile counterpoint to the turmoil still swirling within him. "It's quiet now," Arthur said, his voice hoarse. The words felt inadequate, a paltry attempt to capture the vastness of his experience. Clara smiled, a sad, understanding smile. "The storm has passed," she replied, her voice soft. "But the sea remains." He looked out at the churning ocean, a mirror to the tempest within him. He thought of Daniel, of the vibrant life he had lived, a life now irrevocably intertwined with his own. He'd painted all afternoon, a spontaneous urge, the colors bursting onto the canvas in a way he'd never experienced before, Daniel's passion flowing through him. "I feel different," he admitted, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "Part of me is still Arthur, but a part of you is also Daniel," Clara finished, her voice gentle. "And that's okay. You don't have to erase him to be yourself." He nodded, a tear tracing a path through the grime on his cheek. He looked at Clara, at the quiet strength in her eyes, the shared sorrow, the budding kinship. He had lost Daniel, but in a strange, twisted way he had also found him. He had found a piece of himself he never knew existed. The future, once a bleak canvas, now held the potential for a different kind of masterpiece. A blend of lives, a symphony of memories, a testament to the enduring power of the human heart. The following months were a blur of therapy, legal battles, and the slow, painstaking process of rebuilding. Arthur's penthouse apartment, once a sterile monument to his wealth, felt suffocating. He sold it, the proceeds going to a foundation established in Daniel's name, dedicated to promoting ethical medical research. The stark white walls were replaced by the comforting warmth of Clara's seaside cottage. The scent of salt and wood smoke, a constant companion now, was oddly soothing. He painted almost daily, the vibrant colors a stark contrast to the muted tones of his previous life. Eleanor visited regularly, their conversations stilted at first, then gradually easing into a fragile truce. The sharp edges of their past relationship softened, replaced by a cautious empathy. One evening, sitting on the porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery hues, Eleanor reached for his hand. "I'm sorry, Arthur," she whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears. "I didn't understand." Arthur squeezed her hand, the warmth a comforting weight. "Neither did I," he admitted, his gaze fixed on the ocean. "But I'm learning." Clara entered, carrying a steaming mug of tea. The clinking of porcelain, a familiar sound, broke the heavy silence. She sat beside them, her presence a quiet comfort. "We're creating something new, Eleanor," Arthur said, his voice stronger now, infused with a newfound confidence. "Something better." Eleanor smiled, a small, tentative smile, but it held a depth of meaning he hadn't seen before. The pain lingered, a constant undercurrent, a reminder of the loss, but it was no longer all-consuming. He had lost Daniel, but he had gained a family, a purpose, a life that resonated with a depth of feeling he'd never known. The future was unwritten, but the canvas was vibrant, full of possibility, a testament to the enduring power of a heart that remembered what a mind had forgotten. He looked at Eleanor, at Clara, at the endless expanse of the ocean, and a profound sense of peace settled over him. The storm had passed, but the sea, beautiful and unpredictable, remained. The salty air whipped around Arthur as he stood at the easel, the canvas a stark white expanse mocking his blank mind. He'd spent weeks staring at it, the vibrant colors of Daniel's paintings a painful reminder of his own creative inertia. Clara, sensing his frustration, placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. The touch, so familiar now, sparked a flicker of warmth within him. "It's okay to start small, Arthur," she whispered, her voice a soothing balm against the storm within him. "Daniel wouldn't want you to force it." He looked out at the ocean, the vastness mirroring the emptiness he felt inside. The legal battles were over, the scientist exposed, his career ruined. Yet the victory felt hollow. The memories, Daniel's memories, still pulsed within him, a constant, bittersweet reminder of a life lived and lost. That evening, Eleanor arrived, a hesitant knock at the cottage door. Their relationship remained delicate, a fragile bridge built across a chasm of grief and misunderstanding. They sat on the porch, the scent of wood smoke mingling with the salty air, a shared silence hanging between them. "I've been thinking," Eleanor began, her voice soft, almost a murmur, "about everything, about Daniel, about us." Arthur met her gaze, a silent acknowledgement of the unspoken words that hung between them. He saw a reflection of his own pain in her eyes, a shared sorrow that transcended their past differences. I never understood the depth of your emotions, she continued, her voice catching. I was so self-absorbed. I see now how much I failed you, both of you. A tear traced a path down her cheek. Arthur reached for her hand, his own trembling slightly. The simple gesture held a profound weight, a testament to the shared journey they'd endured. He squeezed her hand gently. It's okay, Eleanor. We're learning. His voice was husky, the words laden with a hard-won understanding. He looked at her, truly saw her, and a wave of compassion washed over him. The anger, the resentment, the years of emotional distance were finally fading. In their place, something new was growing, something stronger, a shared understanding forged in the crucible of loss and unexpected connection. The future remained uncertain, but it was a future they would face together, side by side, their hands clasped together, their hearts forever bound by a shared sorrow, and, in the quiet moments, by a love that was slowly, tentatively, blooming. The crisp autumn air nipped at Arthur's cheeks as he walked along the beach, the rhythmic crash of waves a counterpoint to the turmoil within. He carried a small, worn sketchbook, Daniel's. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery hues of orange and crimson, a breathtaking spectacle that did little to soothe his soul. He opened the sketchbook, its pages filled with Daniel's vibrant sketches of seascapes, mirroring the very scene before him. A wave of grief, sharp and sudden, washed over him. He closed the book, the weight of Daniel's memory heavy in his chest. Later, back at the cottage, the fire crackled merrily, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Clara sat across from him, a steaming mug warming her hands. He would have loved this, she said softly, her gaze drifting towards the flames. This place, the light. Arthur nodded, unable to speak, the lump in his throat too large. He looked at Clara, her face etched with a quiet sadness, a shared sorrow binding them together. He saw in her eyes not just the loss of her brother, but a profound understanding of the bizarre, tragic journey he had endured. I still can't believe it, he finally managed, his voice raspy. This whole thing. Clara reached across, her hand covering his. It's a lot to bear, she whispered, her touch a comforting weight. But you're not alone, Arthur. We're here for you. Her words, simple yet profound, offered a solace he hadn't expected. A tear escaped his eye, a silent testament to the weight he carried, but also to the unexpected comfort he found in this shared grief, this newfound kinship. The following weeks brought a tentative peace. Arthur, inspired by Daniel's spirit, began to sketch, his initial attempts clumsy but filled with a raw honesty. He wasn't Daniel, but he was carrying a part of him, a spark of his creativity, and he was learning to let that light shine. He and Eleanor spoke less, but their silences were different now, heavier, more laden with understanding, and a growing hope for a future together, though altered, still theirs. The ocean, once a symbol of his grief, now felt like a witness, a silent partner in his journey of healing and rediscovery. The courtroom was stifling, the air thick with the scent of old wood and nervous sweat. Arthur sat beside Clara, her hand, cool and steady, gripping his. The scientist, Dr. Albright, a man whose eyes held the chilling gleam of ambition, testified with practiced ease, deflecting accusations with polished rhetoric. Arthur felt a tremor of anger, a familiar heat rising in his chest, Daniel's anger. He realized with a start,